Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 70 being recorded on December 8, 2022. So we're going to get into a variety of things in today's stream, picking up from yesterday's stream, which was a good stream up on the channel now. Unions, unions, unions. That's one of the main things that we're going to be talking about today. Yesterday we were talking about how the squad, most of the squad anyway, screwed over the striking rail workers. We're going to continue today talking about the strike, well, unions in general. We have an article about how being in a union can make you a lot more money over time. As socialists, this is not sort of the main thing that we're interested in. We're interested in building worker power. Obviously, when you have that power, you can use it to make demands such as better pay, better conditions, things like that. We're ultimately interested in deposing capitalists, abolishing capitalism. And, we're primarily interested in that sort of long game of building worker power for the establishment of a new social system, socialism. However, in the short term, you absolutely can use that power for, for example, better pay, things like that. Also, an article on independent unions and how they've been kind of springing up everywhere. And what does this say about the more established unions in the U.S.? Well, I can tell you the more established unions in the U.S. have overseen the decimation of the labor movement over the last few decades, the neoliberal period. And I think that's kind of what the article gets into. We're also going to look at two articles about the ongoing University of California system strike involving almost 50,000 workers. And this is major stuff as far as strikes in academia, which the university system is, the sort of educational academic industry. It encompasses workers doing a variety of things within that field. Obviously, universities employ people in many different positions. We have a grab bag of various odds and ends and other stuff that we may or may not get to, but I've actually learned, it only took me, 70 streams to do it, but I've learned not to advertise stuff up front that there's a decent chance that we won't get to. So let's jump into some random odds and ends first, though. So the first thing that I wanted to do, in yesterday's stream, I was doing like a recap of notable things that happened on the channel or Twitter or something, since last week's streams. There was one I missed, though. So the comments on live stream number 68, this was last Thursday's stream, so a week ago. Just a couple of comments I wanted to highlight. So one said, totally agree that ideologically winning, quote unquote, in debate won't be the thing that leads to real world change. This is the whole liberal marketplace of ideas bullshit. Socialists need to join IRL, in real life organizations that advocate for what people need. So yeah, I would agree with that comment. This was, I think, agreeing with a comment I had made in the stream, I made a few times now, that, a lot of people think in terms of how do we convert people? How do we convert conservatives or liberals or whatever to our way of thinking? And I try to push back on this, like, it's not a religion. You're not just sort of converting people, in words and things like that. What we need to do is build a movement that's actually attaining power, advancing the struggle, and pull people into that movement. And that is how you get people becoming socialists and actively involved in things like that. Otherwise, you just get people treating these ideas as kind of abstract words on paper, and you can't debate fascism away, you can't debate capitalism away. From time to time, as the movement grows, there will be points where the ideologies clash as they get more attention and things like that. But again, the sort of conversion method, that's for religions and things like that. We want to think in terms of building a movement that involves people, and that's how you make more socialists. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely an educational and agitational component to it, but we're not going to just debate away these things, and we're not going to debate socialism into existence either. So I agree. Couple of comments about weapons, because we had talked about, obviously throughout communist history there has been, the observation that the bourgeoisie do not give up their power without a fight usually, and hence, communists have been interested in weapons training pretty much throughout, history. Marx said in 1850, under no pretext, as the bourgeoisie overthrows the feudal governments and the workers set up their parallel workers' governments or workers' councils, or in Russian, Soviets, alongside that fledgling bourgeois government, do not allow the workers to be disarmed, because that was just a key thing. But, we were having some comments there about how the right wing in the U.S., which is kind of a war zone, there's guns everywhere, especially in the hands of right-wingers, and they're used for vigilante violence against LGBTQ plus people and, other groups that have become scapegoats and targets of the far right. We were talking about that and, what that means. Some of the comments I was making is that, this shouldn't be the left shouldn't be mirroring vigilantism. Not that that was especially, the way that the commenter was discussing it, but we shouldn't think of this as an individual thing. For example, you want organizations to be thinking in terms of community defense and things like that. For example, in the case of like a nightclub shooting, it's probably not the best solution for everybody to just be individually packing in there, especially with people drinking and such, but that would be something where the club might need to, have, and there was the example of synagogues and mosques, for example, which have been the targets of far-right shootings recently, having armed security and things like that. So anyway, this is an ongoing conversation that will continue to evolve as socialists, communists get more organized, but it really needs to go hand in hand with the organization. And one of the comments I made is that not everybody may feel comfortable or would necessarily even benefit from firearms. For example, in households where there are firearms, the risk of suicide by firearms goes way up. Obviously, if there's somebody who is really struggling with bad depression, firearms aren't necessarily a great mix. So there's a couple of comments along those lines I wanted to read, which I thought added to it. So first comment, with the SRA, or Socialist Rifle Association, they do have a firearms check-in program for those who might want it or need it, and they'll train you how to properly use a firearm if you're interested. With arming oneself, I personally recommend starting off with getting some pepper spray or mace and learning some very basic first aid. This noob-friendly combo does mean it's less likely to spill unnecessary blood, including your own or that of a loved one, and it can help to handle injuries, including in completely peaceful civilian scenarios. As a trans woman living in the 2020s, I do think that arming myself with a gun is an important thing to do, but I'd still go for the mace before any other weapon in most situations. So, some thoughts there. Second comment along the same lines. People like me shouldn't own firearms. It's too dangerous for me. But the bright side is that war clubs and knives aren't so dangerous. I think that guns require some form of organized control and that not every individual should own one. If I understand correctly, the shooter in the Springs, Colorado Springs, was stopped by an unarmed veteran. Learning how to fight is as or more valuable than owning a gun. The gun is just the tool. You are the weapon. Important point. So a few thoughts there. Also, if I had a recent presentation from Luna Oi correct, another communist YouTube channel, the way that they handle this in Vietnam is people don't own weapons individually. There are property of the various communes. So there's sort of collective weapons ownership and training and things like that. So just a few other thoughts. The left may not want to adopt the exact identical approach to weapons that the right does, in other words. But, this is an ongoing thing, and people who are interested in it obviously pursue gun safety. When I asked for recommendations on this a while ago, a lot of people were recommending Yellow Peril Tactical. Haven't had a chance to look at it myself, but that was one of the recommendations that kept coming in consistently. Let's see what else. There was another comment from Livestream 68. There's a video called GOP Pedo Ring from an account called Midas Touch that goes criminally underviewed and undershared in the left. It's short, snappy, to the point, and concise, like perfect agitprop. Pretty sure that a lib made the video, but if someone you don't agree with makes a hammer, the hammer is still typically useful regardless of the creator's view. Yeah, and as we were saying in yesterday's live stream, liberal anti-fascism tends to be skin deep in terms of why. Why would I say that? A lot of left liberals who are basically supporters and proponents of capitalism, they may be ideologically opposed to fascism as a strategy for managing capitalism. In other words, they take a more permissive approach, and it would not be their first impulse to go to the far right authoritarian, extremely reactionary positions that fascism takes. However, not being communists, they tend not to understand that fascism is capitalism in crisis. It's how capitalism defends itself against workers, any danger of workers' revolution, revolutionary moments, things like that. They roll out the fascism to stop the communists. That's the classic thing of fascism. For example, Italy after World War I had a revolutionary moment, much like Russia had a revolutionary moment. Obviously in Russia it was successful because the Bolsheviks were there and they were just on top of it. Unfortunately, the Italian Socialist Party kind of sucked. And so the revolutionary moment in Italy came and went without a full-on revolution. What do we get like a year or two later? Fascism. This was not just the bourgeoisie saying we need to punish the uprising. That's a piece of it. The bigger piece is we need to replace socialism and communism with something that sounds angry, sounds revolutionary, looks revolutionary, borrows some radical aesthetics, but in its content is counter-revolutionary and can throw people off the scent and is anti-communist and all that kind of stuff. So that's what happened in Italy with fascism. And of course in Germany also, Nazism. There was the Spartacist uprising led by Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht after World War I. They gave it a good go, but it was not successful. And of course Germany fell into heavy reaction after that because of the, quote, danger of, communism and all that kind of thing. So anyway, liberals do not share this point of view. They may be somewhat sincere in their dislike for the far right, but when push comes to shove, when capitalism comes under crisis, who are they going to side with? The people out there doing what it takes, so to speak, to preserve capitalism, or are they going to go with communists? Well, as the saying goes, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. There may be individual liberals who deviate from that, but that seems to be the trend overall. But anyway, the video is just 2 minutes. I haven't seen it yet, but let's check it out and see what is in this Midas Touch GOP video. But again, just while this is loading up, you really have to be careful with Democratic Party claims to, anti-fascism, quote unquote. No, I mean, again, they're for the same system, basically, that the fascists are there as the shock troops of defending. They just want to, hold off for longer from those more extreme tactics. But let's see.
The stunning political scandal that is rocking Capitol Hill. Republican Congressman Mark Foley abruptly resigned Friday after questionable emails he sent to a teenage boy.
Dennis Hastert convicted of a financial crime, part of a scheme to mask something more egregious, his molestation of children.
Hush money used to pay a man who says Hastert sexually abused him when he was 14 years old.
There are now 5 former Ohio State wrestlers accusing Republican Congressman Jim Jordan of knowing about a team doctor's alleged sexual misconduct.
43 men who say they were sexually assaulted, abused, molested, or harassed by Dr. Richard Strauss.
George Nader. His criminal history included multiple convictions for child pornography and child molestation.
This morning, a judge sentenced Ralph Shorty to 15 years in prison. Police caught Shorty in a hotel room with a then 17-year-old boy.
Roy more defiant as more accusers step forward.
alleging sexual misconduct.
This is the shopping mall where some say it was common knowledge and not a big secret that Roy Moore would flirt with teenage girls when he was in his 30s.
One accuser says that Moore initiated a sexual encounter back in 1979 when she was just 14 years old.
The new charges against Joel Greenberg.
Sex trafficking of a minor and stalking a political opponent.
Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz allegedly having a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl.
Investigators examining whether he, quote, violated federal sex trafficking laws.
Ghislaine Maxwell is accused of helping Epstein sexually abuse underage girls.
I've met her numerous times over the years, especially since I lived in Palm Beach, and I guess they lived in Palm Beach. But I wish her well.
All right, there's like 10, 15 seconds left. 5, 4. It's like a really long outro. All right, I guess that's it. Yeah, I mean, you find some of this in the Democratic Party as well. It tends to be more consistent in the more openly reactionary Republican Party, for sure. So again, you know, trying to boil this down to like Democrat versus Republican is not exactly going to work. It does seem to be a general rule, though, that the further far right you are, the more skeletons you have in the closet. Probably for a variety of reasons. But yeah, it's true. It's true. Anyway, decent video. But, you know, again, you know, my lengthy disclaimer doesn't... I think that needs to become much more common knowledge of, like, you know, that the liberal anti-fascism is skin deep, pretty superficial. I mean, and again, they may genuinely believe in this, but when it comes down to... Are you going to take the steps necessary, such as allying with the left, to actually crush this reaction? Will you do it? I mean, they haven't so far. So, anyway, a couple other odds and ends we have here. Let's see. There was, back on the potato discussion from last week, I did actually look up one of the satiety indexes. So, this is how satiated people feel after eating particular foods. Health Revolt, I just wanted to share this. There's a couple of different studies and related indices of people rating how satisfied they feel after eating food. But you can see right there, a little bit above the middle of the chart, potatoes, 323, far more satisfying than any other foods. So you see there, fish more satisfying than red meat. Eggs and cheese in the fats, a little more satisfying than peanuts. And then in the carbohydrates, potatoes, then there's like a bunch of sort of tie for second place between porridge, or I guess we would call it oatmeal, oranges, apples, grapes, brown rice coming in way below oranges and apples. Interesting. I wonder if it's sort of the fiber, it's interesting. And then in the refined carbohydrates, so this is things where you have ground the grain or things like that. Brown pasta coming in the top slot. I guess this would be like whole grain pasta. Beans and sauce, grain bread, and a lot of these are pretty close, honestly. Then in the hyper palatable foods, refined carbs and fat. Popcorn and butter, by far the most satisfying as poached eggs or old cheddar cheese, almost as satisfying as red meat. Then you have cookies, french fries, and so on down the list. But anyway, let's hear it for potatoes, as usual. Pretty soon people will be like, oh, you listen to Socialism for All? Oh yeah, the potato show? That's coming. What else do we have? Story that we almost started doing yesterday, and I wanted to save it for today's grab bag. I couldn't find a follow-up on this yet. It really is from just yesterday. Alberta and Saskatchewan, this is obviously Canada, chiefs call for sovereignty acts to be withdrawn. So this is First Nations people in Canada calling for sovereignty acts to be withdrawn. out of Ottawa. First Nations chiefs in Alberta and Saskatchewan are calling for their provinces to toss proposed legislation that they say is inherently undemocratic, unconstitutional, and infringes on Indigenous rights. The chiefs are putting forward an emergency resolution at the Assembly of First Nations Special Assembly to reject sovereignty bills that are before both provincial legislatures. Chief Tony Alexis, on behalf of Treaty 6, says that there has been no consultation or dialogue with First Nations around the Alberta bill. It has been criticized for giving the Premier and Cabinet unchecked powers to pass laws behind closed doors, although amendments to change that have recently been put forward. Vice Chief Ali Baer of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations also says that the act in Saskatchewan is unconstitutional. It looks to unilaterally amend the Constitution to reassert the province's jurisdiction over its natural resources. Both chiefs say that they do not want the bills amended, they want them withdrawn. It's courtesy of the Canadian press. I will say, just as far as the amount of discussion of Indigenous rights and Indigenous nations asserting themselves politically in Canada versus the United States, honestly, it's very rare to see anything involving Native American people in the United States in any kind of political way at all. Yet I see a lot more of it coming out of Canada, for what it's worth. But anyway, we'll see if there is a follow-up to that story as things progress. Going around the world also, story out of Iran. So a lot of people were really, and this is again more in the sort of opportunist, populist side of things, was really getting freaked out about protests in Iran. Well, it may be that we have a resolution of the Iran morality police situation that doesn't involve, the U.S. completely overrunning the government or all this other kind of stuff that some reactionaries and opportunists were shrieking about. Let us see. So, headline, this is out of the New York Times, so grain of salt, but Iran has abolished the morality police, an official suggests, after months of protests. So this is still sort of, waiting for confirmation, but the move, which the government did not confirm, might be a concession to the protest movement that erupted after the death of a young woman in the custody of the morality police. And there is demonstrations in Tehran in October. The protests ignited by the death of Mahsa Amini have grown to encompass the entire range of discontents with Iran's rulers. So, of course, what the U.S. imperialists would like to see is, everything around the entire world become extremely U.S. friendly so that the U.S. can just sort of steamroll it for, U.S. corporations. As socialists, that's obviously not something that we support. At the same time, is it possible to struggle within regimes that resist the U.S. for more human rights? Yes. So anyway, a bit about this, and again, grain of salt here while more information is forthcoming. A senior Iranian official said this weekend that Iran had abolished the morality police. The state media reported after months of protests set off by the death of a young woman who was detained by the force for supposedly violating the country's strict Islamic dress laws. The morality police, quote, was abolished by the same authorities who installed it, Attorney General Mohammad Javad Montazeri said on Saturday during a meeting at which officials were discussing the unrest, according to state media reports. It was unclear whether the statement amounted to a final decision by the theocratic government, which has neither announced the abolition of the morality police nor denied it. But if the force is abolished, the change will be unlikely to appease protesters who are still clashing with other security forces and have become so emboldened that some are calling for an end of the Islamic Republic. So again, you can sort of see the U.S. wishful thinking in there. They would, of course, like it to be amenable to, quote, democracy, really just unbridled capitalism. As socialists, what do we want to see? It's like people always ask, what's the solution you would like to see in Ukraine and Russia? Well, proletarian revolution in both countries. Don't fight other workers, fight the capitalists, and then make peace internationally with the workers. This is always the thing that we're looking for. Just as the imperialists are always looking for, bulldoze it and open it to U.S. businesses, we're looking for something else. But the opportunists have gotten so emboldened that in this whole just supporting the lesser of two imperialisms thing, that, we'll just find the other capitalism to support and everything else is sort of utopian. Well, now you're just shitting on Marxism the same way that that any capitalist would in the U.S. or otherwise. So, again, let's not lower our standards to the point where we forget about class struggle, etc., or just, try to sweep it away as not realistic. How are you any different? What's revolutionary about that? So anyway, the morality police is overseen by the Iranian police, not the Attorney General. And there were suggestions on Sunday that the government might be trying to play down the significance of Mr. Montazeri's remarks. One state television channel, the Arabic language Al-Alam, said that the comments had been taken out of context, and other state channels said that the government was not backing down from the mandatory hijab law. So it seems there are some still struggling to maintain this in place. Iran's foreign minister, Hussein Amir Abdullahian, when asked about the abolition of the morality police at a news conference in Belgrade, Serbia, where he was on an official visit, did not deny it, but said, in Iran, everything is moving forward well in the framework of democracy and freedom. That's fairly vague. For his part, Mr. Montazeri said on Saturday that the judiciary would still enforce restrictions on, quote, social behavior. Days earlier, he said that the authorities were reviewing the law requiring women to cover their bodies in long, loose clothing and their hair with a headscarf or hijab, and would issue a decision within 15 days. But it was not clear whether the authorities were planning to relax the law. Anyway, it goes on for a while. If you want to continue reading, you can. Just wanted to sort of lodge that in there as a note. Also, we were just mentioning Ukraine and Russia. So this is a story from In Defense of Communism, Marxist-Leninist site, idcommunism.com. And this is from last week, December 2nd, last Friday. Union of Communists of Ukraine, letter to the Russian Communist Workers' Party. So this is not the main Communist Party in Russia. That would be the KPRF or CPRF, Communist Party of the Russian Federation. There are other parties that, criticize and don't consider KPRF actually communist, etc. The Russian Communist Workers' Party was one of these other groups. So we have done statements in the past from Union of Communists of Ukraine on the channel. I want to read this one out. This is specifically directed to the Russian Communist Workers' Party as far as how things are going. So Union of Communists of Ukraine, letter from the Union of Communists of Ukraine to comrades from the Russian Communist Workers' Party. At this critical moment, when the instigators of imperialist war managed to pit the peoples of the two, until recently, fraternal republics that founded the Soviet Union, the Russian Federative Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, against each other. The republics which made the greatest contribution to its great deeds, industrialization, the victory over German Nazism, conquest of outer space, development of unique Soviet social relationships, creation of the outstanding Soviet culture, we address to you, the rank-and-file communists, who are just like us, not seeking comfortable seats in the Duma, Verkhovna Rada, or local parliaments, who do not wait for any approval of those in power, with whom we will share the glory, and to whom socialism, built in battles, will be a common memorial. Where are we? For almost 3 decades, professing the principles of proletarian internationalism, revolutionary Marxism, and historical continuity, the Union of Communists of Ukraine has been both an ally and a structural unit of the Russian Communist Workers' Party. So just highlight that for a second. Since basically the end of the USSR, mid-90s, so almost 3 decades, the UCU has been an ally and a structural unit of the Russian Communist Workers' Party. So close relationship here. We were together when, within the Communist Initiative movement and the Marxist platform in the CPSU in the early 1990s, we tried but failed to save the party and our Soviet motherland from destruction. Together, we share this historical guilt of failing to raise the people to fight, and both of us bear the worst possible punishment, the loss of our socialist motherland. Over the next 2 decades, we stayed together, though each in his own shard of the USSR, at rallies and demonstrations, at factory checkpoints, in pickets, at lectures and labor collectives, in our personnel apartments, turned into editorial offices. In our personal apartments, turned into editorial offices for producing leaflets, bulletins, the magazine Marxism and Modernity, the newspaper Workers' Russia, and other publications. We were one in our not recognizing as communist the parliamentary parties of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and the Communist Party of Ukraine, debunking their political conformism and ideological revisionism. We were united in denouncing these parties as opportunist. Both of us shared an assessment of them as petty bourgeois at the beck and call of the big bourgeoisie. Time has confirmed our common rightness, or correctness. The road of these parties is the road of a gradual slide into the mire of bourgeois parliamentarism and rejection of class principles. The names of their leaders have become nominal, symbolizing the betrayal of the cause of the proletariat. We were united in our assessments and actions, albeit with some time lag on the part of the RCWP leadership, when the Maidan roller went through Ukraine in 2014, towards which the working class Donbass rose and stopped the roller in its tracks. When the masses in the Donbass put forward pro-Soviet field commanders from their ranks who were organizers of combat units, people from the people, the very same Soviet people who, remaining loyal to their proletarian flair and the heroic tradition of the Donbass anti-fascist resistance, did not submit to the offensive of extreme reaction, paying the ultimate price for this, the lives of thousands of heroes. Quick comment here just to explain a little bit of the background for people who might be new to this. So in 2014, actually I think it's better to back up a bit more. So 1991, 1992, end of the USSR and the reintroduction of capitalism, basically the complete collapse of the entire system, producing and distributing everything within the USSR. It had been done through the party, through the government, and when the party was, when politically this was dismantled, industrially and economically, everything went with it. When I say collapsed, it doesn't mean that, it economically failed and fell in on itself. Politically, it was dismantled, which meant because everything had been going through the, proletarian state, there was no alternative mechanism. So throughout the 1990s, it was basically complete chaos and mafia rule, and the free market, people from the West were coming in and trying to set up shop. Eventually, Putin came in and sort of started organizing things to a bit more recognizable extent, not just extreme chaos, but rebuilding along capitalist lines in Russia and so on. Ukraine, not being the major powerhouse, geographic, like territorially, in terms of oil and gas, etc., that Russia is. Ukraine was caught between Russia as a sort of major pole of influence and power, and Europe as a major pole of influence and power. And so since that period, after the USSR, it's been caught between these two. And you see that about the western and northern 2/3 of Ukraine tend to favor Europe, culturally and otherwise, and then the third, that is more to the east and south, tend to favor Russia. That's just been historical. Politically, the country has gone back and forth between more pro-Russian and more pro-Europe, and of course by extension pro-US, because Europe and the US are in close politically and economically. There's been this tug of war, and that's been both, sort of internal and external. In 2014, this took a pretty sharp character with a very far-right, pro-Europe, U.S. Political initiative going in. And the Donbass uprising in the far east of Ukraine initially was much more socialist in character. That's not the case today. But initially it was. That's why some people are confused. These things were called, the People's Republic of, these areas over there. Initially, this was a lot more left-wing than it wound up being. So that's what they're talking about here. And of course, that got co-opted quickly in favor of the very much not socialist, Russian government and annexation, however people are looking at that. Anyway, continuing. Those members of the RCWP who had correctly assessed the situation in the heat of the moment joined the working group and made a significant contribution to the anti-fascist resistance in Donbass, both in word and deed, by making dozens of trips to its cities and front lines, by propagating communist ideas, by setting up communist groups and organizations, distributing communist press, and providing versatile assistance to fighters. The members of the working group went to Donbass as if they went to the workplace, and not out of idle curiosity or as extreme tourists, not to shoot at targets with combat weapons and have a drink or two from their hospitable hosts. Our comrades traveled to Donbass under shelling, in the heat, in 20-degree cold weather, under pouring rain and snow, sometimes across 3 borders, bending under the load of newspapers, magazines, and warm clothes for the fighters, with the money collected by the workers. It is the fruit of their work, their contacts, that are now being used by those who are hiding behind the opinion of some Donetsk and Luhansk residents, still clinging to the cobweb of a ghostly hope for Big Brother to justify their support for the military aggression of the bourgeois Russian Federation. What's wrong with the leadership of the Russian Communist Workers' Party today? Where have revolutionary integrity, internationalism, conviction, and honesty gone? Where has communist honor gone? We feel ashamed watching after their political actions, entering into alliances with dubious and openly reactionary political forces, inconsistent, non-communist actions, leading the party to lose its image as a proletarian party. We are writing to you in the face of the imminent threat of a complete political degeneration of the RCWP, its definitive departure from its class positions, and therefore an immediate threat of complete ideological degradation and the inevitable disintegration of the party. This degradation can also be traced on the level of personal morality of the leadership. The shameless manipulation of the name of Tamila Yabrova, Comrade Rose, attempts to hide behind her undeniable authority, bright name, and glorious deeds to support their, in our opinion, fundamentally erroneous position. Even in the eulogy published after her death, her name was used by the leadership to settle an old score with Cherepanov. It reads that Yabrova denounced the position of the RCWP, omitting at the same time to mention that she equally blamed in this split the top leadership of RCWP as well. Meanwhile, in a Skype conversation with her in the presence of witnesses late 2020, early 2021, Comrade Tyolkin made the offensive remark that she had allegedly sold out to Cherepanov, given that the Tyumen organization had helped publish Marxism and the Present-Day Journal, the only Marxist theoretical and practical journal in the entire post-Soviet space, on several occasions. V.A. Tyolkin hopes that Comrade Yabrova will no longer be able to prevent such manipulations, but this is not the case. All the Marxist dialectics of her approach in her assessments of world events and party affairs, so fully and vividly realized in her speeches at internal party and international theoretical events, in discussions with the leading figures of the international communist movement, show what position she would have taken now: the resolute condemnation of the imperialist war unleashed and the struggle with imperialism fraught with it. Comrade Tyolkin is silent about the serious disagreements between the leadership of the RCWP and the UCU, which lasted all the last years of T. Yabrova's life, both in relation to theoretical work, organizational work, the emphasis on elections, and the half-hearted and inconsistent work with the Donbass comrades. These disagreements became so deep that Comrade Tiolkin announced that he was resigning from the editorial board of Marxism in the Present Day, and Comrade Yabrova announced that she was resigning from the Central Committee. Moreover, having taken the situation in the party hard, she raised the question several times before us whether the UCU should leave the RCWP, and each time she decided, for the sake of preserving the party unity, to wait and try once again to change the minds of formerly like-minded comrades. It is not for the first time in history that an imperialist war has become more than an ordeal, a watershed, approaching which both left-wing political figures and whole parties either fell into oblivion, such as the Social Democratic parties of the First World War times and the parliamentary parties that emerged in the former Soviet republics in the 1990s, or stayed in line in the revolutionary battles. Sorry, wrong. This is what happens when you name your things with similar abbreviations. I need 6. There we go. A complete distortion of Comintern Leninist doctrine of imperialist war and the position of the parties is the provisions put forward by the RCWP about absolutely bad and not so bad imperialism. Well, this sounds exactly like what we were just talking about, the lesser of two imperialisms, etc. The RCWP leadership has picked up with unwavering stubbornness the slogan of denazification, so skillfully manipulated by the Russian bourgeois authorities, who openly sympathize with fascist philosophers, politicians, and war criminals. Is all this for the sake of a shameful pre-election alliance with the opportunist CPRF and KPU, and moreover, with the Limonovites and other reactionary and pro-fascist patriotic filth? Comrades, by supporting such pseudo-denazification, you are supporting the destruction of Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure, and the deaths of civilians. Were these the military tactics of the Soviet Red Army during the liberation of Germany in 1945? No, it was diametrically opposed to the actions of the anti-Hitler coalition allies, who bombed dozens of German cities: Dresden, Hamburg, Magdeburg, Bonn, Dortmund, Meisburg, Nuremberg, etc. Today in Ukraine, dozens of cities have been destroyed or semi-destroyed as a result of the invasion. Kharkiv, Mariupol, Irpin, Volnovaka, Izium, Popasna, Rubizhnya, Severodonetsk, Artemivsk. There we go. Who in Kiev have been denazified by the destruction of the energy and water supply systems? The fascist Ukrainian authorities? Not at all. They are quite comfortable with their autonomous supply of any resources. The trouble is with the residents of the city, with the most unprotected ones, those who do not have personal transport, money savings, and especially health to bring water to the nth floor of a Soviet high-rise without a working elevator, or to get hold of electric generators, those who have neither cottages nor even small summer houses with ovens to get away from the city and wait out the cold. There are many such families in the capital, especially pensioners, old people who were working in Soviet enterprises for most of their active lives and did not accept the new Ukrainian nationalist values. What else do the patriotic, quote, anti-fascist pro-war advocates support? Do they happen to support the denial of the right of the Ukrainian people to a national identity? Just like in Tsarist Russia, and not at all like in Soviet Russia. The RCWP has not officially commented on these disgusting passages of the Russian president. So this is, of course, a reference to Putin talking about, oh, Ukraine is interested in decommunization. Well, we'll help you with that, because after all, prior to the USSR, Ukraine was just part of the Russian Empire, and we can make that happen again. We, the majority of the UCU, which the RCWP leadership has dubbed, sometimes several times on the same page, with the labels backsliding from class positions, opportunists, anti-war advocates, etc., it is from a class-based internationalist position that we declare we deny any such accusations against us, considering them to be a Jesuit turning from a sick head to a healthy one. We also consider it comradely unethical, even unacceptable, when in a discussion on the most serious fundamental issues of our time, the opponents get personal, especially discuss the details of personal biographies with third parties, at times when this threatens the personal safety of Ukrainian comrades. We have exhausted possibilities for discussion with the party leadership of the RCWP. These have been attempted at several public international events and in personal correspondence. We have not received a single substantive response to our arguments, apart from the fact that we have too many words, or the absolutely absurd and insulting accusation that we allegedly wish defeat for Donbass. We consider it impossible for us to remain in the ranks of a party that has tainted itself with the tactics of tailgating its bourgeois government and supports the fratricidal slaughter unleashed by the imperialists in brutal competition for resources and political hegemony, in which the representatives of the proletariat on both sides of the front die in the first place. We continue the struggle against imperialism in the ranks of the world communist movement, above all, shoulder to shoulder with those revolutionary parties whose glorious history of intransigence in all matters of agreement with the bourgeoisie, and whose authority make it possible to mobilize the working masses for active action against the arms supplies that are fanning the hotbed of imperialist war on the territory of Ukraine. We know that there are comrades in the RCWP who have a different point of view, and in case their position prevails and the party changes its assessment of the current situation, and more importantly its current tactics, we will again be together in the service of the proletariat in the forms that correspond to the historical period in which we have had the opportunity to live and act. Until then, our paths diverge. Because of the repeated shift in the emphasis of the summer party schools from training for class battles to training for general and local elections, in simple terms, a shift from training for the future to training for the moment, we take responsibility for the development, preparation, and implementation of party training for young comrades. Comrades are kindly requested to take special note that since our former comrade in charge of the UCU website remains loyal to the RCWP leadership and posts materials that contradict our line of thought, this website is no longer the official site of the UCU. We have set up a new website called Rosengarten, Garden of Rose, at rosengartenjournal.com, approved by decision of the General Meeting of the UCU, 28 November 2022. So that's the end of that statement. So this is unfortunately a split called by UCU from the RCWP, which is again a separate Russian Communist Party from the KPRF or CPRF, which is very, very obviously Putin-tailing and revisionist and opportunist in like any way you can think of. We've covered stories about them supporting the anti-LGBTQ plus laws enthusiastically, even helping to draft those, and so on. This is a different party than that. Unfortunately, according to UCU, they are now sort of gravitating in that direction. They wish that, you know, people who continue to hold a better line prevail in the RCWP, but until that happens, they have to split from them. It's a very unfortunate development, but we'll, we support any Marxists anywhere who are actually holding the line against revisionism and opportunism and not just going for the lesser of two imperialisms and all of this kind of stuff. You hate to see it, but it's important to note to just understand current events. All right, I think that that's about it from the grab bag. Oh no, there is one more thing, and then we'll get to the chat. We'll chat for a while, then we'll get into the longer articles. So I did mention yesterday, coming back around to the U.S., we did an article about how Joe Biden could do an executive order to help people struggling with rent. The rent is too damn high, and Biden's not doing a fucking thing about it. It's not just rent, it's prices across the board. Inflation is when prices increase. It is going crazy, and that includes one of the, for most households, the largest single line item is rent. And Biden could do a lot about this. Anyway, in that article, they mentioned that there was a housing activist group that had drafted an executive order. All Biden would have to do is sign it. We can't read the entire order because it's like 12 full PDF pages, but I did want to actually highlight some of this just to show people this is what's actually being done. And they have met at the White House for this. They went before Congress, if I'm remembering the article correctly. This is the kind of thing that they're pushing for. With a stronger left, we might be able to, be able to fight this out in the media, get more attention, rally more people to it, et cetera, and get some teeth into the fight for this. The people who are working on this are doing everything that they can. Ultimately, this often just comes down to a game of numbers. How many people can you get turning out? How much of a problem can you be for the people in power, et cetera? But anyway, let's at least sample some of this executive order. So it's titled Executive Order on Protecting Tenants and Stabilizing the American Economy. Again, Biden has not done this. It's just been drafted by a housing advocacy group, for Biden to sign. Will he do that? He's Jim Crow Joe, probably not. But this is what we could be doing. By the authority vested in me as president, by the Constitution, and by the law of the United States of America, and in order to promote the general health and welfare by promoting housing stability for tenants and overall economic prosperity during an ongoing national emergency, it is hereby ordered as follows. Section 1, Policy. It is the policy of this administration that everyone should have access to safe, accessible, and truly affordable housing. 44 million American households rent their homes. Tenants are struggling to keep up with historically high rents and endure the threat of eviction and homelessness, with rippling consequences on their lives, their communities, and the economy as a whole. My administration will make sure that tenants are protected from rent increases that threaten their ability to afford housing, and threaten our nation's ability to build a strong and equitable economy. Now, time out. Of course, capitalism is never really going to be equitable, but on the road to abolishing capitalism, you could at least compress the differences. You could attempt to get some of that inequality reined in so it's not just ever increasing. Ultimately, though, this is the natural tendency of capitalism, and if you want a permanent solution to it, which we need, you need to abolish capitalism. That requires the building of a lot more political muscle than the working class has right now, but that's one of the things this channel is here to assist with, and others like it. Continuing, Americans are paying too much for rent. Housing costs are American households' single biggest monthly expense. The majority of tenant households below the poverty line spend at least half of their income on housing, with 27% spending over 70% of their income on housing costs alone. So that's over a quarter spending over 70% of their income on housing costs alone, having virtually nothing left over. As a result, rent increases deeply impact people's economic security. Every rent increase is a threat to a tenant's ability to pay for medication, feed their children, and age with dignity. When families are forced to cut back on expenses, cutting back on housing is not an option. With a shortage of truly affordable housing, moving or downsizing are often not viable options. So what are you going to downsize to? The small stuff is still crazy expensive. Also, people who were previously able to afford more, medium tier housing, even upper tier, a lot of times have gotten there already because they were, they downsized first. So there's nothing left over. The alternative is homelessness. This administration will take decisive action to protect renters from unfair, unjust, and unaffordable rent hikes. Rents are a major driver of core inflation, and unchecked rent inflation poses a long-term threat to our nation's economic stability. Nationally, median rent is over $2,000 for the first time ever. Landlords are raising rents at the highest rates in over 40 years. Rent makes up approximately 1/3 of the consumer price index, impacting urban, suburban, and rural communities alike. In 2022, there isn't a single state, metro area, or county where a worker employed full-time at the federal minimum wage can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Soaring rents are a pressing racial justice issue. Nationally, 58% of black households and 51% of Latino households rent their homes, compared to just 28% of white households. So time out. That's why intersectionality matters. You can talk about overall trends. A lot of times as you break down into different demographics, you can get a clearer picture. And not everything, things can be class issues, but then if you go into the racial and gender cross-section, for example, there's often sizable discrepancies. So there's a big one. 28% of white households rent their housing, but a majority of both Black and Latino households rent their housing. So that's a pretty big difference there, racial inequality. Due to systemic racism in real estate practices, predatory lending, lower household incomes, pervasive housing discrimination, and a lack of deeply affordable housing, a majority of Black and Latino tenants were already paying rents higher than they could afford prior to the current rent crisis. 40% of homeless Americans are Black, even though just 13% of the population is Black. Let's read that again. 40% of homeless Americans are Black, even though just 13% of the population is Black. So Black Americans vastly overrepresented in the homelessness crisis. Rapidly escalating rents and the shortage of truly affordable housing make tenants more at risk of discriminatory harassment and abuse by landlords because they lack other options, and it puts them at risk of homelessness. Institutional investors have consolidated the rental market, driving up rents to maximize record profits and hurting the American people. Beginning in earnest after the 2008 financial crisis, corporate landlords have bought up an increasing share of our nation's housing supply, including both single-family and multifamily units. Excessive rental market concentration threatens basic economic liberties, democratic accountability, and the welfare of tenants and their communities. Rental market consolidation has laid the groundwork for institutional investors to raise rents beyond the costs of maintenance, improvements, or the rate of inflation. This amounts to price gouging. Property management companies are using algorithms and other anti-competitive practices to artificially increase the price of rents. As tenants struggled to keep up, the 10 largest publicly traded apartment companies reported profits soaring by 57% from 2020 to 2021. So while you're struggling, their profits soared by 57%. A congressional investigation also found that some of these landlords engage in unfair and deceptive practices, such as misleading tenants about the availability of emergency rental assistance funds that could have otherwise kept them housed during the pandemic. Institutional investors face limited regulation, mostly under state law, but their businesses have expanded beyond state borders. As the rental marketplace has become national and even multinational, federal housing policy has failed to adequately track and regulate the market in order to protect tenants. We must act now to reverse these dangerous trends, which severely impact poor and working class families in America and constrain the growth and dynamism of our economy. Historical and structural inequities will deepen unless we act. Thus, this order calls for a whole-of-government approach to addressing skyrocketing rents. Federal financing through the government-sponsored enterprises, GSEs, beneficial tax treatment for real estate investments, and incentive programs such as vouchers and tax credits support the private rental market through public resources. It follows that the federal government has a role to play in regulating a changing market, furthering the racial equity and competitiveness goals of this administration, stabilizing the economy, and protecting American families from this growing national crisis. This order affirms that it is the policy of my administration to protect tenants, to implement and enforce policy that supports housing security, and to support tenants' rights to organize. Tenants, like workers, require the power that is found through unions to protect their position in an ever-changing market. It is also the policy of my administration that eviction shall always be a last resort within federal housing programs and within any housing financed by government-backed loans. Unreasonable rent hikes, even when they don't result in a formal eviction, often cause similar distress for tenants, forcing them out of their homes. It is also the policy of my administration to enforce antitrust laws to meet the challenges posed by market consolidation across many sectors, including the housing sector, to combat the excessive concentration of the industry, the abuses of market power, and the harmful effects on tenants. It is also the policy of my administration to support aggressive legislative reforms that would regulate rents and offer more comprehensive tenant protections in all American housing units, financed or subsidized by public money or not, and through other related reforms. This executive order builds upon President Biden's Executive Order 13985 on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, EO 14036 on promoting competition in the American economy, Clinton's Executive Order 12892, leadership and coordination of fair housing and federal programs, affirmatively furthering fair housing. This order supplements President Biden's Housing Supply Action Plan. While the plan provides necessary interventions to address the affordable housing shortage in the long term, this order enables urgent and immediate action to protect tenants from unreasonable rent hikes, wrongful and unjustified evictions, denial of a lease renewal, and retaliation for organizing. So it goes into various particulars at this point. I'll have to stop reading now just for the sake of time and everything. But if you're interested in this, find a housing action group in your state, community, city, whatever. Get active. Find something national. If there's nothing there, support that. We need action on this. Neither Democrat nor Republican, let alone libertarians and whatever else, are even talking about this. But it's a major issue driving poverty, homelessness, people just basically getting driven out of the ability to participate in society in any kind of a dignified way at all. So anyway, that is pretty much the roundup of stuff from today. Before we get into sort of the new content for today, let's take a break and talk to the chat for a while. Been going for about an hour here. So let's see. And of course, I'll be way behind. We've been reading for like 45 minutes, so it'll take a while to catch up. Did you see New York Times workers are striking? First time in 4 decades. I had not seen that. I saw something about like a Reuters strike a few weeks ago, but I did not see the New York Times workers. That's great. I mean, we need more and more strikes, and we need to, I think one of the problems as the strikes come back is they're still going to be tainted with the kind of concessionist, broken back, non-militant union ideology that is why we're at this low point currently. We need to renew a sense of militancy, learn the lessons of the last 4 or 5 decades, and vow never again. Kick all these people out of leadership. We'll talk about some of this in the longer articles, but we need to strip out every last trace of the neoliberal just this ideology that has pervaded in the union leadership for the last several decades. That is what has helped to bring labor to its knees. Unless we want to have, a brief resurgence due to the absolutely desperate economic situation that we are experiencing, only to have that same ideology come back and then cripple the union movement again. We need to kick it out. So, this is what I say about it's great. People ask for like recommendations of parties to join and things like that. I don't think that we have the party right now. I recommend a left coalition of existing parties getting together. I don't think any of the parties are strong enough or large enough to do that much on their own, but together they probably could, and it would be good for all parties involved. It would get more attention for all the parties. More people would be likely to see them, and then there would also be discourse between the various parties and this and that. But bottom line, we talk in Marxism-Leninism about the vanguard. What's the vanguard? It's the part of the working class that is the most historically and economically educated. It's the most class conscious overall. Class consciousness comes in part from, book learning and the sort of academic discussion, but largely it comes from experience. You can, it's important to read your history, know your theory, know some economics, know something about how bourgeois politics works, like this and that. That's important to understand the sort of, world that we're operating in right now with capitalism. But the experience of participating in a union drive, or, you know, a tenant organizing drive, or whatever, a ballot initiative effort for a minimum wage or something like that, you know, some other social justice issue, you can learn so much. It can sharpen your class consciousness so much just partaking in that struggle. And then you go back and read the history and theory, and it has some tangible meaning to you out of your personal experience. Like you're able to link this up with things you've seen in real life, and it makes more sense, and it you know, undergirds and reinforces your actual working knowledge and understanding of all these things. So, you know, the bridge between theory and practice becomes closer for you. So the vanguard is a relative term. It's the most class conscious portion of the working class. So you, in a way, always have a vanguard. But if you have low amounts of struggle, you know, crappy struggle, crappy vanguard. That's basically, if we were to boil this down to a slogan, we need a lot more struggle. That will generate a lot more class conscious people. And we obviously need to reinforce that with party building and, you know, careful study of theory and things like that, to make sure that the organizing and the consciousness develops, you know, sort of as fluidly and productively as possible. But yeah, crappy struggle, crappy vanguard, and we're still getting the struggle. You know, we're still sort of trying to start the lawnmower here, you know, pulling on that pull chain. It's still just starting to get going. You can hear the motor going again, but we're in the beginning stages of that, unfortunately, after a long period of decimation and deterioration. So anyway, to your average libertarian, everything is oppression except actual oppression. In a nutshell, yeah. Yeah, they're so concerned about false issues like, oh my God, they banned half-gallon sodas, slippery slope to death camps. No, maybe if you tried understanding, you know, a little bit more about what was going on there, you know, that might help. But yeah, utterly, thoroughly, and oftentimes even willfully confused people. Libertarians are. And that's key of fascism, is a sort of willful, you can't educate me, depth of ignorance. That's stubbornness. Is there a self-help to fascist pipeline? Yeah, well, you said in your next sentence the thing that brought up for me. I would say not necessarily. Not necessarily. But to continue, I feel like the individualism baked into self-help is toxic. You know, again, it depends exactly on what you're reading. Let's not, you know, smear all self-help stuff with the same thing. A lot of the gurus, you know, and you can get a bit more specific here, may have, you know, it may encourage even like magical thinking. Somebody like a Wayne Dyer, somebody like that. It's not all awful, but, you know, sometimes if you take it to extremes, you get into stuff like The Secret and stuff like that. And I think that there's a possibility for people through that sort of consciousness raising to eventually come to the conclusion that, you know, we live in a society and therefore a lot of your conditions are socially determined. Because if you try these individualist approaches to sort of changing your life, you will quickly realize a lot of it is just determined by you know, social conditions far removed from your control, your parents' control. You know, like any of the conditions that sort of shaped you psychologically, it's going to be like a lot bigger than any of that. It's social, and therefore trying to change those falls under the heading of social change, you know, change agentry and advocacy for political action and things like that. So, I mean, I think you can go through these things and develop a more social, you know, mindset, but yeah, it would help if they sort of put more of it in there directly. Now, there is, you know, within the therapy world and self-help literature and things like that, there is some things that are more socially conscious and that do emphasize that stuff. There is also the kind of, you know, will to power, magical individualism stuff that's out there. And yeah, that probably is more appealing to people with a petty bourgeois, you know, heroic individualist mindset. So is there some of that? Yeah, I mean, sure. We live in a country, the United States, that really, really prizes that kind of thinking. And yeah, it's if you come out there with a guide telling people how to do that successfully, it's like the small business owner that everybody's supposed to just sort of drop down to their knees and worship and grovel at, this sort of like champion of the American dream. It's like this great hero. There's a lot of prestige, at least historically, tied to that image. So if you get a guide that tells you, here's how you too can be this, white knuckle it, rugged individual, and it might be presented through a more gentle self-help context. But yeah, so in other words, people who are looking for some kind of psychological help, personal improvement, things like that, there's a lot of really qualified therapists. There's clinical social workers that can help you with whatever problems you're facing and have actually been trained in a more socially conscious way to look at, the social systems and workplace systems that you're involved with and things like that. But yeah, stay away from the things where it's just sort of like my mantra for success and all that kind of stuff. There are things emerging that I think are more commonplace now than they were a few decades ago, for example, that have psychological well-being tied to social consciousness and eventually social struggle as well. So anyway, continuing, the majority of us will make actual helpful changes to our lives by working with others towards shared goals. Unions are a great example of this. Yeah, actually, this is one of the things about the article. Unions, even within a capitalist framework, unions are one of the strongest protections against poverty, which of course causes many other problems. Now, in capitalism, capitalists have so much power that they're able to stack labor laws in their favor and make it extremely difficult to organize unions. This is why we need broad worker organization for political purposes, not just on the shop floor, that is important, but also in the political realm. This is something Lenin really emphasized, is we need pushback in so many different ways. So yeah, I mean, just the amount of meaning that you can get through that sort of social participation can be healing in itself. I mean, a lot of people wind up in a really broken, antisocial state due to the lack of opportunities for meaningful social interaction. And by the same token, working on social political struggles and campaigns, it can be very frustrating too. And, a lot of times it can attract very angry people who sometimes bring some of that anger, not in a righteous way, but in kind of a toxic way, into organizations. So, I mean, you got to watch out for that. And there's, potential for things to get really heated within those struggles. That said, sometimes people meet really great comrades, and it's kind of like, the missing link as far as like giving their life some more of the meaning that they were looking for, struggling against, common conditions that are oppressive and exploitative. So yeah, but good question. So let's see. I have a Christian cousin who is so convinced all communists were anti-gun because he thinks liberals and Marxists are the same. Pulling out hair emoji, fun conversations. Yeah, this is, it's so many of these like reactionary Christians start from such a paucity of knowledge. They're watching PragerU and things like that, and they just have no idea about anything at all. It's challenging. It's challenging to even begin those conversations. Again, as always, do more listening than talking. 75% listening to 25% talking. Ask questions that draw out their reasoning, gently confront and discuss, things where they're mistaken on or challenge their assumptions and so forth. It's an art, and even then, success is not guaranteed for sure. I lived in France, Turkey, and now living in Germany, but with simple research, I didn't find a popular Marxist org that I thought was pure Marxist and not revisionist. This is the curse of our age right now. Marxists are vanishingly, it's just so hard to find. We're trying to build that back up. I'm hoping Marxism can have a moment again by the end of the decade. That's why I use the hashtag Revolution 2030. This is not caught on. It's not gone viral, let's put it that way. But I'm putting that out there as a placeholder. The idea being, we saw libertarians build through the late 90s and 2000s, have a big moment with the Tea Party. Obviously, that was also funded by a lot of capitalist money, but it was preceded by a lot of grassroots sort of discussions amongst the more reactionary petty bourgeoisie, especially on the early internet. And then in the 2010s, you had kind of a lot of SocDem stuff, and Bernie Sanders eventually sort of marked the high water mark of the SocDem moment. I'm hoping that through a lot of pointed building and messaging and education, agitation, organizing, there can be a similar moment, hopefully more successful, for the far left, for Marxism, by around 2030. Regardless, this needs to happen. The left, such as we have, could certainly stand to be more genuinely anti-fascist, more genuinely anti-imperialist. You can't do either of those things really without socialism. We were talking before about the skin-deep anti-fascism of liberals. And, at a minimum, we need that, whether we pull off a revolution or not in this country or that. We can certainly improve the left. I think that process is already underway. But, yeah, you're right. As far as trying to find decent parties, they're small. I think that currently in 2022 going into 2023, they tend to be the smaller, more underground parties. And may we see a day where they overtake the old revisionist parties, the sort of remnants from the 20th century, which largely need to be overturned at this point. There may be some exceptions to that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. But this is why I tell people also, get out and meet your local left, such as it is. Most people who are going to be involved with any party or union or organization, at least half of them are going to be involved in some other project or know somebody who is. So get out there and network, make yourself available, get to know your left, and you may, through that way, find something that is more underground. I remember, in the 2000s it was like just needle in a haystack trying to find a lot of this stuff. I think that's changing now in the 2020s, and we need to, help facilitate that. But I feel your pain for sure. Liberalism and fascism are opposites. No, they are different styles of managing capitalism. To a certain extent, capitalism and liberalism are synonyms. They can be used that way. When we talk about left liberalism, as opposed to conservatism, and then fascism is a sort of extreme example of conservatism. These are different styles of managing essentially the same class system. So, hope that helps. Did Japan ever have a revolutionary moment before World War II? The first comment is not really, but a large communist movement post-war. My understanding is the same, that Japan did not have a revolutionary moment before World War II. And my understanding of the Japanese communist movement after the war even was that it was very much muzzled and restrained. I think they did some anti-nuke stuff, but I think it was pretty restrained. With the U.S. involvement and all that stuff. So, there were conditions that certainly helped with that. I think one of the things it's important for people to know about Japan is, we talk about Russia and China being semi-feudal societies, and that was true of Russia, or of Japan as well. Japan was being a series of islands. They had historically, similar to Korea, gotten a lot of culture. There's a lot of cultural influence from China, which of course was a powerful empire much earlier, thousands of years before, and had, established its imprint on the entire surrounding world. Japan being, kind of an island country was fairly closed off compared to many of the other countries when the U.S. eventually started in the 1800s trading with them. I mean, they were at a very, very different stage of cultural development than many other places. And so that, this sort of extreme traditionalism that you see in like Japanese fascism, there was still just so much social backwardness. So anyway, just a few notes, random notes on Japan there. For confronting fascism, is a united or popular front the correct strategy, or is social fascism more correct? Well, so there's a few things to unpack there. We've talked about this a lot, and there is a playlist on the channel called Understanding Fascism and Right-Wing Socio-Political and Economic Movements. On the channel, it has a lot of videos in it, including things like from Dimitrov, the Comintern policy about fascism and things like that. So united/popular front, I would want to break those apart first of all. So a united front is a front that involves all of the different proletarian elements, including non-communist ones. I think that is probably, and then a popular front is ones that include non-proletarian elements, not just proletarian non-communist, but that include non-proletarian. So petty bourgeois, even bourgeois elements. Now, my take on, what I took away from the Dimitrov readings was that basically in a country, at that time, like Spain, their bourgeois revolution was much more recent, like around 1870. It was like a lot later than, say, England or something like that. The proletariat was not as well developed as a social force. It was not as numerous in terms of just numbers in the population. And in that setting, a popular front involving non-proletarian elements might be appropriate if those other non-proletarian elements actually express some aversion to the fascist style. However, in other countries, like in England or something like that, where there's such a large proletariat, the emphasis on a united front of proletarian elements makes more sense. But I mean, as far as, is the position of all social democrats or social fascists more correct? I think it's a question of, you got to look more closely at individual situations. That's what I would say. In the case of Germany, where you had the SPD actively collaborating against communist revolution, well, that answers your question. In other cases, you may have different conditions in different courses of development leading to different things. So, but yeah, the larger point I would say that people need to understand for something like the U.S. today is the leadership of CPUSA, the opinions of most of the rank and file notwithstanding, which runs counter to this, but the leadership, heavily opportunist, long-standing opportunist leadership of CPUSA, which tails the Democrats, always trots out these strategies for, popular front, vote against fascism. This is irrelevant at this point in the United States when you're talking about the Democratic Party. We need to be building a left coalition and go from there and see how far that gets you. But until if you don't even try the left coalition, if you don't even try a coalition of proletarian and semi-proletarian forces, and you just jump to like tailing the fucking totally bourgeois Democrats, and again, a lot of people we talked about this yesterday, a lot of people who consider themselves supporters of the Democratic Party hold opinions that are not represented by the Democratic Party. So you got a lot of people who, if given the opportunity to jump ship from the Democratic Party, would, but a lot of people are waiting for that critical mass, like they're not going to be either the leader or the first follower or the second follower. They need that thing to be big first, and then they'll jump on it. So I say, like, we need the Bernie moment, but outside the Democratic Party, where you're getting, stadiums filled around a far left message, but this time not tying it into the Democratic Party. you can actually do that. When people see 10,000 people lining up for some rally, they're like, I'll go check that out. And if they're like, you know, hey, we're going to do all the things that the Democrats keep promising that everybody wants, and then some, we're going to go even further beyond that to do things people want, but the Democrats won't even entertain, and we will, you know, stamp out all the reaction in this country, I think that would go a long way. So before you start tailing, you know, bourgeois forces and using this popular front rhetoric from 80 years ago, when you know, the proletariat was much less developed and not as numerous, you need to look at what's right in front of you and try to actually build up the proletarian class-conscious forces, anti-fascist forces first. So anyway, yeah. And yes, read Black Shirts and Reds. Let's just throw that in there. It's up on the channel. I gave a lot of comments on Black Shirts and Reds while I was reading it, Michael Parenti's work. We have the full audiobook up on the channel. It's both up as chapters and a full audiobook. Literally eating potatoes right now. That's what it's all about. Can we instead of bread tube, we can be Tatertube? I would love that. Tatertube. We're more satisfying than bread. We're even. Now, don't get me wrong. You know, some good peasant bread is wonderful stuff. Makes your whole house smell good when you bake it, etc. You know, good for you. Still, though, nothing's gonna beat a nice steamed potato. Tatertube. You heard it here first. I'm adding that in right after Revolution 2030 to the hashtags. It's Tatertube. Yeah. Just pulled up my potato crop today. Well, there you go. Potatoes, you know, not that hard to grow. You got to watch out for certain bugs, but you can just take, I mean, it's better to get seed potatoes, but I mean, you can even take commercial potatoes, cut them up so there's at least one eye on each one, let them harden over, and then plant them. Butter makes everything better. Well, yeah, and don't forget, no, never mind. No, I didn't even go there. And I wouldn't say necessarily everything. It can just add a lot of useless calories sometimes without actually adding any satisfaction to the food. So, you know, be judicious with your addition of fats. You need certain fats and oils in your diet. There's certain things, essential fatty acids. Essential things in the diet are things that you need but which your body cannot synthesize. So, for example, there's essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. You can get non-essential amino acids in your diet, that's fine. But even if you don't, your body can make them. But it's the same with essential fatty acids. Your body can make some fatty acids out of other stuff for its functioning and structure. But there's also essential ones that you actually need to get in your diet because your body can't make them, but it does need them. But yeah, butter, not so much. Anyway. As much as my mind was blown by the fact that the British Empire starved the Irish colony despite the surplus of food produced by the Irish workers and exported it to the European markets for profits, I'm equally stunned by the history of potatoes, which a New World crop bred by indigenous agriculturists in the Andean mountains created as a high-calorie staple that could grow in dry, rocky, sun-beaten mountain lands for the pro-social purpose of feeding their population. Saved the lives of the Irish who, despite the famine, ate a mostly potato diet. Indigenous win-win technologies saving human life generations after the initial society dies. You know, I must say I'm loving going down this potato road. And there's so many different types of, you get, you know, if you have the choice between, by the way, white potatoes and gold potatoes, go with the gold ones. They're better for you on several counts. But there's other kinds too. Unfortunately, many of which are expensive. But there's purple potatoes. There's all kinds of stuff. And eat your colors. Colored foods like fruits and vegetables usually are full of all kinds of antioxidant and sometimes anti-inflammatory properties. Good for you. Eat your colors. Reds, purples, yellows. Good stuff. Incidentally, also a lot of green leafy stuff. I mean, the green is good for you. The green is chlorophyll. And, green leafy vegetables tend to be very dense with nutrients per calorie. Low calorie, high nutrient. So high density of nutrients per calorie. That's good. You want high density of nutrients per calorie. In places where there's a cold fall, fall and winter, why is it that the leaves on the trees turn, yellow, orange, red, all the different colors that they do? Well, it's because what happens is as it gets colder, the chlorophyll dies out and it reveals the coloring that was underneath the green the whole time. So it's not that anything changes, it's just that the green dies back and you can see what was underneath it, that yellow, orange, red, etc. So those are again other compounds that are good for you, and they're found in leafy greens as well. All right, there's a lot of sort of arguing in the chat today, and I would just remind people not to do that. It's not all the discussions are terrible, but it does make it a bit harder to read. So here's a controversy time. I don't buy the argument, a commenter says, from CPUSA members who say, my local CPUSA is good. This is, of course, the Communist Party of the USA. But leadership is bad because, one, if the majority of the party hates leadership, why has leadership been revisionist since like the 1930s? And two, Lenin specifically said you can't organize in reactionary organizations. You need to break away. A lot of the actual... okay, that's a different comment. Well, it's out there. I think that one of the things happening with CPUSA is it has been revisionist and heavily opportunist with regard to the Democrats for quite some time now. And a lot of the more recent membership bump, has been just that recent, like in the last year or two. So, there's the possibility that they haven't been able to change it yet. There's that possible argument that could be made. On the other hand, why was it there before this too? Was it just like, in other words, it's not just that we got good communists in the last year or two. Communists are supposed to be communists, not opportunists. Why was it like that before? And I've heard it both ways. I've heard some people say that Joe Sims, who's the current chair, is an anomaly. And I've heard other people say that no, he's a good reflection of the principles of CPUSA. It seems like it really just, no matter who you ask, you get sort of a different thing, yet no real solution. That said, I have heard a lot of people say that their local has, joining their local has really positively improved their life. Bottom line, we need a better... Again, crappy struggle, crappy vanguard, that's going to be reflected in your parties as well. And but it works both ways too. Crappy parties can hurt the movement too. So this is something that needs to be addressed at some point. Is it worth it to join an org that doesn't fully fit your ideology just to start organizing and learn to organize? I would say at this point in 2022, USA, with the fragmented, tiny state of the left, yes, get to know your local left. Meet people, network with people. What I would like to see is people getting involved, taking what is good out of what's here, networking with other people to maybe recombine into different organizations 3 to 5 years from now. But I think until people get out there, it's just not going to happen. We've seen attempts to, form like PC USA, for example. A lot of that's been through the internet. I don't think that is really successful. Peace USA, for as much as, you know, they've been around online and stuff, I think they had about 110 members as of this recent split. So not a very big, I mean, literally Caleb Maupin's organization was bigger than that. The Spank Tank was bigger than that, and like by double. So, yeah, I think it's better to just go out there, get to know your local left, try to find other communists, get real projects going, build the movement up, get the membership up, you know, try to get people reading the right stuff. Maybe we get the parties again 3 to 5 years from now. So anyway, that's, you know, I'm happy to have like entertain reasonable discussion on that, but to me that seems like maybe the best approach, but that's where my head's at. You know, we had, for example, like the Bernie moment twice, 2016 and 2020. You saw tens of millions of people like coming out of the woodwork, you know, tens of thousands of people rallying in city after city in favor of, you know, fairly significant popular reforms at least. And then many people were to the left of Bernie as well. Like Bernie was arguably the right tip of the Bernie movement. There were, of course, you know, other people in that same vein, sort of, you know, tepid social democrats. But there were a lot of people, myself included, supporting that as an actual leftist, as a positive development within the U.S. left. Well, those people didn't all, you know, go away or die or anything. We're still around. And we need to do that again, but outside the Democratic Party. And again, reinvigorate the struggle, see where it goes. Revisionism has done more damage than any U.S. invasion ever could. I'd say it's at least as big of a threat, for sure. I mean, don't underestimate the threat of revisionism. You know, people are like, why you go after Caleb Maupin for, you know, a couple of misguided tweets? First of all, I don't think it's misguided. Caleb Maupin was a member of Workers' World Party, you know, over 10 years ago, has actually done some of the readings, definitely knows better, knows what neo-fascism is when he is promoting it. But it's because we have to, you know, maintain correct positions, otherwise the movement can deteriorate, and then all your organization actually winds up being working against the working class. We want to get organized as workers to advance our interests. Because why? Organization amplifies and improves any actions that we're doing. But by the same token, if you're taking the wrong positions, that amplification is actually going to work against you. So, yeah. Thoughts on possibility that Alexander Dugin and KPRF could stage a fascist coup to the right of Putin to overthrow him? I don't know. I haven't been following it that closely. You know, would this be the thing that they call USSR 2.0, except it's actually the Fourth Reich? Maybe. Maybe. I think people are so confused at this point about what Marxism even is, you could get away with something like that. So, anytime you mention raising the minimum wage to a Republican or Democrat, they're like, well, that'll make everything else go up. Like, everything already is going up. God, capitalism is stupid. Somebody asked, KPRF, this is again Communist Party of Russian Federation, is pro-Dugin. I knew they were revisionist, but that's fascistic. Comment, KPRF, when it was first formed, its constitution was written by Dugin. It's also allied with Nazi parties in Russia in elections. It's beyond revisionism at this point. It's just fascist. This, again, I think people need to revisit what is actually fascism. And again, we're, you know, trying to... We have a playlist of like 90 things. To that point of view, a lot of what's being pushed under the name of populism today is, in fact, fascism. You see like Jimmy Dore going completely down that road, stumping for Giorgia Meloni, things like that. Yeah. So there's a comment, the suffering of the people has softened up over the years. It's more difficult to educate people on Marxism. Yes and no, in my opinion. So let me offer a few thoughts on that. So people's hardships are different than they were 100 years ago. You know, 1922, we have a lot of technology now that objectively makes life a lot easier. Not everybody has it, but many more people do. Have. Just name a labor saving household device, a vacuum cleaner, for example. Processing a thought. Don't want to get too far off track, but anyway, the kinds of hardships that people deal with in today versus then, I don't know that the overall quantity actually has softened up. We have more gadgets, we have more devices, we have more entertainment, we have more diversions. Housing is just as unaffordable as ever, maybe more so now. Medicine, again, out of reach for many in most cases. Education. So you got medicine, housing, education. We have a lot more cheap gadgets. The right wing often points to that. When the right wing talks about quality of life, they'll talk about TVs and toaster ovens and things like that. When you talk about housing, medicine, things like that, clothing, transportation, if you live outside of a city, and sometimes even then trying to get around without a car, extremely difficult. So there's still a ton of hardships today. Being poor in the U.S. in 2022, homelessness is today a thing like it really wasn't 100 years ago. As we've covered, this is largely a product of the neoliberal era. So in some ways, we don't have some of the brutal hardships that we had in the past. At the same time, for some of it is quality rather than quantity has changed. Okay, so there's that. Also, educating people on Marxism, post-USSR, post-China capitalism, which is a mixed bag and a point of controversy. But anyway, there are quite a number of countries, Eastern Europe, USSR, etc., which no longer exist. A lot of people do not know anything about what went into that. And it's very easy for people to say, well, doesn't it not work? And this isn't necessarily from a fascist point of view directly, but they may just genuinely think factually, communist parties had their chance and it didn't work. Again, reading something like a Black Shirts and Reds goes a long way towards correcting that. And, this is going to be an ongoing effort. I think a major part of the 2020s push to resuscitate Marxism. So I think that there's different things that make it difficult to educate people on Marxism. Also, living in a tyrannical police and surveillance state doesn't help. So even if you get somebody sort of sold on the concept of organizing, a lot of times they will jump down the line to, well, but the cops can do this and there's cameras everywhere and this and that. And a lot of people there's a lot of underlying fear that gets triggered. So I think that there's a lot of problems, honestly. So, that is one of them, that people content themselves with like all their gadgets and devices and things. But I think there's a number of problems that we need to keep drawing out and, dealing with as this effort rolls along. I just found out that one Stormfront user, Stormfront is a neo-Nazi web forum, is an infamous zoosadist who gets pleasure from hurting animals and allegedly also children. This guy is still free and living in Washington, perfectly normal country the USA is. I wonder if he's a police asset. Most of those people in the right wing anyway are wannabe cops. They'll say themselves that they hate cops because, they have their own, vigilante style of doing things. In the end, they're all working for white supremacy and all the same kind of stuff anyway. But yeah, most of them, they get busted and then they become, police or federal informants. That's extraordinarily common in the right wing. That's why they're always fed jacketing each other in the right wing, and it's like most of the time it's correct because it's crawling with cops. So yeah. Yes, a will to improve your situation is in part the basis for socialism. The desire for dignity and the recognition that getting those conditions for yourself means changing the entire society. And that it's on a class basis that we achieve that liberation? Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Why not both? Potato bread. Yeah, actually, potato bread's great. So yeah, if you make bread, you can just substitute like a third of the flour with mashed potatoes, and you can make potato bread. It's really good. Okay, we got our first like true troll in the chat today. I guess mods are busy today, but yeah, bye. Oh boy, what is this comment? I think that people need to advance in politics and leave the socialism and fascism idea and democracy. I feel like political philosophy has stagnated since the early 20th century. No, so here's the thing about that. We live in something called class society. Class struggle is the motive force of history. It is the main engine driving history. There are other factors that determine the like specific course of history and events. However, the overall thing is class struggle. So we're in capitalism right now. That is the mode of production currently. Okay. Prior to capitalism was something called feudalism, which was a lower stage of production and sort of what was possible industrially. Capitalism overthrew that a couple of centuries ago. I mean, it depends on the timeline for what part of the world you're in. But capitalism is currently the dominant mode of production on the planet. The thing about capitalism is it creates over time a large class of dispossessed workers who own no productive property. The only commodity that we have to sell in a society which is based around the exchange of commodities is our labor power. So we don't own anything but our hands and our brains, so to speak. So we sell our labor power to live. We're called the proletariat, propertyless, dispossessed workers. So as capitalism goes on, it creates a larger and larger proletariat. You have the capitalist class, which is a tiny ruling class that owns industry on a private basis. That industry is the means of production that encompasses the raw materials and the equipment and everything that's owned on a private basis. And so you have basically two class interests that are dominant in society, the capitalists and the proletariat. There are some other classes like the petty capitalists, small capitalists. These are insignificant though in terms of both numbers and property. Capitalists are few in numbers, but they're great in property, therefore they're a significant class. Proletariat is low in property but great in numbers, therefore we are a significant class. Petty bourgeoisie has to ally either with the bourgeoisie or with the proletariat to get anything done. It's very hard for them to advance their own interests though, but you see it in movements like fascism. Anyway. But even fascism gets led around by the nose by the big bourgeoisie, with the petty bourgeoisie thinking that they're large and in charge. This is actually reminding me of how people say that libertarians are most like house cats, in that they are convinced of their own sort of omnipotence, but actually completely dependent on an artificial environment. So, this is, libertarians are crypto-fascists, sometimes not even so crypto. But that's sort of the thing of the petty bourgeoisie. They think that, they can assert this rebellion against big capital. No, because in capitalism, it's basically capital versus labor. Okay. So you get politics that arise out of that you just simply cannot move beyond. All politics are going to flow out of these class interests. Fundamentally, you may get slightly different flavors of this or that, but basically the politics tend to revolve around the class interests. You cannot wave that away. It's material reality. And so the goal of the proletariat is to, in this system, the interests of the capitalists and the interests of the proletariat are diametrically opposed and antagonistic. What's good for capitalists is bad for workers and vice versa. The capitalists want more profit out of us. They want more work out of us for less money. They want to pay you lower wages and get more work out of you. They want to give you a smaller apartment and charge you more rent. They want to, charge you more interest on the loan, etc. Our interests are the exact opposite. They're antagonistic and diametrically opposed. We want to keep the product of our labor, and we want, more leisure time and all this stuff. So our basic interest is in getting the capitalists out of power. Taking that power, that would be a socialist revolution, is when there's a change in the ruling class. Deposing the capitalists and the working class becomes the ruling class. So you can't really move beyond these things because they all stem from capitalism. They all stem from the class interests that actually really exist. That's the material reality. And so the different kinds of class collaborationist politics that emerge are all just some illusion of like, oh, we're moving beyond this. No, you can't move beyond this. This is the basic problem of resource distribution and work and all that stuff that is shaping everybody's experiences on a daily basis. And if your politics don't address that, then they don't mean anything. Anyway, the right wing in Sweden has an ugly trick. They change words so that they end up in their favor. They've invented the word child poverty, for example. Children have no income, so the word itself is BS. Well, wait a minute. Child poverty is also just the measure of children living in poverty. Children are dependents on adults. I don't know what you're talking about with Sweden, but there's a perfectly valid use of the term child poverty in the United States. So I don't know. Just because children don't have any direct income doesn't mean that they're the people that they depend on don't have income. Yeah, so anyway, I'm not really sure where you were going with that. But no, children living in poverty, that's still a working class issue because their parents are earning the wages that either keep the children in poverty or not. So Caleb Maupin called Jason Unruh mentally ill. Nice ableism, Caleb. Well, it's a lot easier than for Caleb to walk back his Nazi politics, the whole we need an alliance with industrial capitalists thing that he was going on about. Maupin should just fucking stop. I know somebody's got to be bankrolling him. Between the RT and the LaRouche and the Dugan, somebody's got to be bankrolling him. But man, does he need to fucking stop. I mean, how old is he? He's not even, is he 35? He's not even 40, I don't think. And just fucking stop. Seriously. I don't know where he's going to go from this, but I mean, boy, he is not handling his, quote, comeback very well. Yeah, there you go. I know I'm further down in the chat for potato talk, but for those that like pasta, check out gnocchi. It is potato-based, and it is my favorite type of pasta. There you go. Gnocchi. All right. I'm hungry as hell. I forgot to eat before the stream. Let's get into some of the major articles for the stream. So, I promised unions, nothing but unions. Let's actually attempt to get into that today. So, is this the first article I wanted to do? Yes. Business Insider. Being in a union means you could make $1.3 million more over your lifetime. A new paper looks at the impact of being in a union throughout your entire career. The authors found that being in a union means a $1.3 million bump to lifetime earnings. Being a career-long union member can have the same value as a college degree. That's the current shape of things. This is from October 11 by Juliana Kaplan and Madison Hoff. Let's get into it. It's a short one. If you want to make $1 million more over your lifetime, here's one solution. Join a union. That's according to a new paper in Cornell University's ILR Review. What's the ILR Review? Industrial Relations. This is industrial and labor relations. Cornell is one of the few places around the United States that still has kind of like a robust industrial relations or labor studies department. And hence, anyway, that's one of the things that they've done. Researchers Zachary Parolin of Bocconi University and Tom Van Hoevelen of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities examined the advantages of being part of a union throughout your entire career. Quote, we find that a person who spent the entirety of their career in a labor union were predicted to earn about $1 million more over the course of their career compared to somebody who was never in a labor union, Van Hoevelen told Insider. To quantify the impact of unionization on lifetime earnings, they used the panel study of income dynamics, which tracks some Americans every several years. The researchers zoomed in on men who would have been in their late 20s in the 1960s and 1970s, and they tracked their earnings through retirement as well as whether or not they were union members. The result was the $1.3 million premium for workers who spent their whole careers in unions, even those who were never in a union. Sorry, skipped lines. Even though those workers were more likely to retire earlier. So again, shorter work life, yet still more money. This is in the working class's interests, and it's the exact opposite of what capitalists want. They want to work you till you're dead and pay you as little as possible, because every dollar they don't pay you is profit to them. Workers who were never in a union were projected to earn about $2.1 million through their whole careers, while those who were in unions for their whole careers were estimated to make $3.4 million. So it's by percentage, that's a substantial increase. It's long been clear that union members make more than their non-unionized peers. In 2021, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, non-unionized, by the way, if you want, to find out what's going on with the U.S. labor movement and just work in general, BLS is a decent source to check out. Non-unionized workers made just 83% of unionized workers' wages. Let's read that again. In 2021, according to BLS, non-unionized workers made just 83% of unionized workers' wages. So there's another 17% you're just missing. But again, this is 2021, continuing. But the study shows the long-term effects of a career spent as a union member. The data also comes after decades of American wealth becoming more and more concentrated at the top as union membership tumbled and continues to drop. So you can see there, that chart goes back to about 1980, union membership at 20%. If it were to go back further, union membership, I believe, peaked around 1960 at in the low 30s percentage. About a third of the U.S. Workforce was unionized. There's also big discrepancies between the private sector and the public sector. Public sector wasn't always able to unionize, but since they gained those rights, that's been around 35-40% of the public sector has been unionized. The private sector today, much, much lower, 8%. Overall union density right now is 10.5%. But going back several decades, you go back 50 years and, or 60 years, much, much higher in the low 30s overall. So anyway. And again, that affects not just people in those jobs, but all the other jobs have to compete with the union jobs. So it does raise conditions everywhere. Because if you're a capitalist, you want to keep the union out of your workplace. So you try to preemptively meet some of the demands and be like, well, look, you don't need a union. We do a lot of the stuff that the union does in the other workplace. So anyway, that's how it raises standards. Continuing, all this research that has been done shows that unions are really important for inequality and that the demise of unions is a really important contributor to this growth of economic inequality and economic polarization. Hands down. Let me add to that. There's another screen, but let me add to that. What's one of the things that has had the labor movement in retreat? Well, zoom out to the international scale, and the creeping revisionism and decline of the international communist movement has also, even in the capitalist countries, hurt the labor movement. So there's been a shrinking of left-wing forces all across the post-war, post-World War II, latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. In the socialist countries, it is manifested as, a retreat from socialism. In some cases, the complete loss of the government and reinstitution of, dictatorship of capital. In other countries, it's just been, walking back of many of the socialist measures, even though there may still be a communist party in power. So it's, it's reflected in all countries. It's hurt the left, and that includes unions in capitalist countries. Workers without college degrees particularly benefit from career-long union membership. In fact, a worker without a college degree who's been in a union for 100% of his career is actually expected to make more than a non-union worker with a college degree. That's significant, especially with the college premium that higher education affords for lifetime earnings. Going to college is still one of the most reliable ways to boost how much money you'll make, although many borrowers now come up against thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. But unionization rates have declined over time, and that spells bad news for workers without a college degree. Quote, if suddenly the United States lost the college premium, that would be a disaster, Van Heuveland said. A lot of newspaper articles would be written about that. But it seems like we've lost something equivalent for America's working class. Well, let's stop there. People who get college degrees, most are working class too. Let's not fall into this crappy definition. Let's still try to make our definitions of working class and owning class Marxist, in other words, in relation to the means of production. Do you own them? Do you manage them? Do you just merely operate them? So, for example, the bourgeoisie own the means of production. The petty bourgeoisie don't always own, well, sorry, I meant for this to be a brief aside, and it's turning into a much longer thing. Petty bourgeoisie oftentimes owns small means of production. Petty bourgeois consciousness can also be in people who just manage a company that is owned by the bourgeoisie. So in other words, they don't own, but they do manage it. So they don't, own production, but they do control production. Proletariat neither owns nor controls production. So anyway, we'll just keep that in mind. Many people who have college degrees are in fact working class, the majority. But also, there was another point I was going to make in there. The thing is that, as they say, a lot of articles would be written about if the college premium was lost. And in fact, we see some of that happening now. But the reason is that's because the capitalists can put that on individual choice. In other words, they hate unions. It's collective mass action by class-conscious workers that challenges capitalists' power in the most direct way possible. And that power, again, can be used to get better pay, better conditions, whatever. Of course, they're not going to write tons of eulogies in their newspapers and on their shows, mourning the loss of unions. They've been trying to bury unions since the beginning, or at least muzzle them to where they can't hurt capital. But the college premium, it's like, oh, you've bettered yourself in an individual way. Continuing, there are some signs of life in the previously small labor movement. Union approval is at its highest since 1965, according to Gallup survey results. Workers have been pushing back for over a year, sparking a crop of unions in places like Starbucks, Amazon, and Chipotle. The number of union representation petitions filed in fiscal year 2022 increased by 53%. That's good news, according to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, the agency that handles union elections and recognition and stuff like that. Arbitration of certain disputes between unions and employers. But all of that is still coming up against low union membership rates and other organizing challenges. Quote, the process of deunionization that's occurred over the last half century or so, that's what I was talking about since that decline in the 60s, has really undermined an important second channel through which people could find a path of upward economic attainment, Van Heuveland said. I mean, really, people who were born in the 90s or 2000s even listening to this, like, it used to be different in this country. Things are so bad right now. The conditions, if you're in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, it just wasn't like this before. Things have really, really gotten bad. The left has been hurt. This loss of unions is a major part. I mean, unions are kind of the backbone. Like, it's organized labor. Yes, you also have to organize for political power. It's where Marxism-Leninism comes in. But as far as proletarian organizations, labor unions are among the most important, absolutely. So, huge loss. It's, the parties are in disarray. And again, this is dialectical. That pain has gone in both directions. Bad parties hurt unions. Bad unions hurt parties. And boy, do we have to get this turned around. Anyway, let us go to our next union-related article. This is from In These Times by Hamilton Nolan, September 19 this year. Independent unions are great, and they're proof of labor's broken institutions. The inspiring wave of independent labor organizing also represents the failure of existing unions. In other words, hey, it's great to see all these independent, non-affiliated unions popping up that maybe aren't connected to a large labor federation like AFL-CIO, also known as AFL-CIA. But it's also like, well, what's going on with these labor federations that so many people are going independent of them? Let's read. This year has brought a lot of stirring labor victories, a pace of union campaigns and strikes so frenetic that it's easy to collapse in a puddle of undifferentiated cheering for stuff. The most important trend, though, has been the sudden rise of independent unions, organizing drives at untouched companies led by the workers themselves, not affiliated with any existing major unions. The Amazon Labor Union, or ALU, has been the biggest example of those, and an endless stream of others seem determined to follow in its footsteps. An independent union drive succeeded at Trader Joe's, and they've popped up everywhere from Apple to Chipotle to Geico. The rise of all these independents is inspiring. It's the flowering of seeds that were planted by 40 years of rising inequality and by the work of an entire generation of labor movement activists pushing unions as the solution. If we're being honest, though, the story of these independent unions is also a story about the brokenness of organized labor's existing institutions. This is what I was saying before. These are the existing institutions that presided over this massive fucking decline, and that we need to sweep these things out if we're going to have a sustained resurgence. If we ignore half of the story, we won't learn anything from this moment. One thing that virtually every independent union that's popped into being this year has in common is this. They're at places that should have been unionized a long time ago. I don't just mean that in the generic sense of all workplaces should have a union. I mean that if America had a union movement with even a modicum of ability to do strategic planning on a national level, the big unions that already sit in these respective industries would have been working hard to build campaigns at many of these companies years ago. Amen. United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW for example, is the grocery industry union. It should have been plainly obvious a decade ago at least that Trader Joe's was a prime target. A successful, growing national grocery chain that also carried with it a cultivated reputation for caring about employees, as well as the community and social justice. That is the absolute pinnacle of characteristics of a company that should be a union organizing target. The fact that this country's first Trader Joe's union election happened in the year 2022 and was organized by workers themselves is a pretty harsh rebuke to the UFCW, which represents 835,000 grocery workers and has more resources than all but a handful of other unions. In other words, like, things are as good for the UFCW as things can get for a union right now, and yet what are they doing with those resources as far as expanding and planning? The more of industries that you take over, just the more power labor has. It's like elementary. Amazon, Apple, Chipotle, Geico, all of these are premier employers in industries that have existing unions. You know what I'd love to see? A McDonald's union. I'd love to see like all the fast food places go. Would love that. In many cases, the existing unions have organizing drives at these companies themselves too. Communication Workers of America, CWA, is organizing Apple stores, and at Chipotle unionized with the Teamsters. and the Retail, Wholesale, and Development Store Union, RWDSU, is still deeply engaged at the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, and UFCW is organizing Trader Joe's, all of which are good examples of the ability of independent drives to energize moribund sectors or to pick up excess demand where existing unions don't. The problem here is not the failure of individual unions, but of an entire union establishment that has for decades accepted the proposition that it's the responsibility of workers to come ask unions to organize them, not vice versa. By the way, yeah, I saw a poll a while ago where a majority of U.S. workers say they would join a union if there was one in their workplace. That's huge. It's so hard to start one, though, and let alone, like, even if you were to try to begin the effort of building one, where do you even begin? I mean, we've put up IWW organizing manuals on the channel. We've put up, organizing in the steel industry, that old one from William Z. Foster that allegedly was used in the Amazon labor union drive. Like, there are organizing manuals there, and I recommend that everybody read them. That's why I put them on the channel as audiobooks with some commentary. I'm really trying to get people to read those. But you have to go pretty far out of your way to do that, to look up one of the unions that does more DIY independent drives, like the Wobblies, for example, the IWW. Meanwhile, you have all these business unions that are sitting there on top of piles of dues money, and what are they doing? It's like contributing to the status quo, more like. All right. Let us imagine an American labor movement that had, 1, a genuine belief that it's the responsibility of unions to offer every worker in their industry a true opportunity to unionize, and 2, a rudimentary level of central organization and accountability that could exert some pressure on unions that weren't organizing to do a better job. I have a comment, but let's finish the paragraph. In this fairy tale world, it would still take bravery and hard work and idealism from workers at all these places to undertake the daunting and uncertain prospect of organizing their workplace for the first time. The difference is that they would all have had the card of a union organizer in their pocket. And that is a big difference. Because the unions in their respective industries would have made a strong effort to organize them and would have made it their business to ensure that all the non-union workers at those companies knew that this union wanted to organize them. So when the stars aligned and the moment arrived, when the employees were ready to take on that challenge and a campaign was going public, they quite naturally would have thought of the existing union as their first phone call. Broadly speaking, that's not what happened. I say this as someone who has for years now fielded incoming emails from random people asking me how to unionize, and have tried to get them in touch with union organizers from the right unions. It's always been shockingly difficult, especially for the majority of people not lucky enough to be working in the very narrow slices of industries that are already subject to ongoing union drives. Really liking this article so far. These are very real problems. Before we go on to the next page, they talk about this fairy tale world where an American labor movement has the genuine belief it's the responsibility of unions to offer every worker in their industry a true opportunity to unionize, and a central organization and accountability that would be putting pressure on unions that weren't cutting it to do better. Understand, a lot of the unions are not really there to challenge the system. In fact, to do the exact opposite. I mean, why has it been that we have seen over, it's not a fluke, it's over decades, the systematic dismantling of the organized labor movement in the private sector? That's not an accident. Like, that is there because the people in charge of these unions are probably paid to do that. At a minimum, they're just absorbing the absolute wrong ideas and not trying to correct them. And that, why aren't they trying? I mean, the simplest answer is somebody is making them interested in something else other than trying. My guess would be the capitalists who have enormous amounts of money to throw at them. In the past 7 years, I've tried to help Amazon workers and Trader Joe's workers, and Whole Foods workers, and even insurance company workers find a union to help them organize. For the most part, it's been hard to find the right union. hard to find the right organizer at the right union, and very hard to get an overworked organizer at the right union to dedicate a sufficient amount of time to leads like this. There are heroic union staffers everywhere, but not nearly enough of them. The problem is not the individual people. The problem is this sort of thing, which should have always been the top priority of a labor movement that's been losing density for decades, has not been much of a priority at all. Yeah, again, time out. I would push back on that. I mean, even since the beginning, you know, more conservative labor federations like the AFL, they would scab directly against the Wobblies and things like that. I mean, they're oftentimes guided by very, very inert ideologies. So, yes, I mean, are there overworked individuals in this and that? But why is the movement not in better shape? Why is it not picking up energy rather than losing it? And again, it's not like it was just happened in the last 5 or 10 years. It's been going on for like 50 years, longer. So plenty of time, I mean, literally 3 generations there to fix something. If it's not getting fixed over that time, that's deliberate. Anyway, so the pandemic happened and a tipping point was reached, and there's been a widespread grassroots surge of interest in unionizing, and surprise, many workers have come to the conclusion that it makes a lot more sense to organize themselves than to spend forever making calls to existing unions that have never spoken to them before and have not spent the money to build the organizing staff necessary to give them the time that they need. This makes perfect sense. The hard numbers tell us that America's biggest unions have allowed their organizing muscles to atrophy, and now that game day has arrived, they're largely too weak to play. Let's add in here, and I think that this article addresses it, the reliance on the Democratic do-nothing party. This has been obviously not an alternative to building, power on the shop floor, not even slightly. It's not mentioned here, but anyway, this must be a moment of reckoning for the people who lead unions and control their budgets. Yeah, I mean, donating to the Democratic Party versus donating, setting aside that money to a strike fund. As much as we cheer on the resolve of workers who take it upon themselves to organize independently, we must also turn to the unions in their industry and say, hey, why didn't you get that? I don't want a bland stream of cheerleading tweets from the AFL-CIO about this trend of independence. I want nonstop meetings of top union leaders cowering in chagrin over how it came to this in the first place. Oh, believe me, they probably are cowering in chagrin, but in private, going, God damn, we did our best to keep this union movement as weak as fucking possible. And, they're just going around us. Like, watch this be made illegal at some point. Like, you have to affiliate with one of these, approved unions that, like, donates to the Democrats or something. Honestly. Anyway, this moment in history is an unfolding demonstration of the fact that organizing must be a non-stop practice. You cannot just allow it to wilt for decades and then expect to flip it on like a switch when the national mood changes. A recent report found that organized labor in America employed 23,000 fewer people in 2020 than it did in 2010, even while its bank accounts swelled. Gee, just like it's layoffs within the labor unions, even though they're getting more money. How many of those people were potential organizers who could have been sitting in coffee shops or McDonald's parking lots across the street from Trader Joe's and Amazon warehouses and dreary white-collar office buildings talking to workers about what a union could do for them? A lot. So note to the guy who wrote this article, you want to see this stuff? We need independent new labor federations. It's just not going to come out of these existing ones. Yeah, you will get a series of bland cheerleading tweets from the AFL-CIA basically taking credit for people overcoming the very shit that they've been, like, the very decimation that they've been overseeing. They're like, yay, go workers. No, you literally, like, destroyed this movement, basically. Philosophically, there's nothing wrong with having an independent union. Practically, there are many drawbacks. It can take a lot of time and money and expertise and lawyers to get a solid first union contract in place. It doesn't always take a lot of lawyers. Again, this is, building power on the shop floor. You can get anything that you want with sufficient power on the shop floor. Those are things that existing unions have that independents don't. Yeah, but again, this whole approach is part of what sank the movement, right? That's what we're not seeing here, is that's part of what sank this movement in the first place. It became completely not about shop floor organizing, building power in the workplace, organizing workers, not just workplaces, and relying on the teams of lawyers and all this stuff. That's part of how the labor union died under its own weight. Anyway, winning the union vote is great, but only a first step. Unions got big and coalesced in the first place because solidarity is power, and money and staff and political connections and law firms. Again, this is a very, very, very limited view, especially, this is obviously not somebody who thinks we need to abolish capitalism, which is, should be the long-term goal of any serious union. Many of the independent unions that do manage to win a union election will inevitably migrate towards existing unions over time, or they will get crushed by their multi-billion-dollar employers willing to stall and litigate every single thing rather than bargain a fair contract. There's another option here I don't think he's written about. Hang on. I'm going to clear my throat and take a sip. All right. There's another option I don't think he's considering here, but I'll mention it if he doesn't. So some independents will join bigger unions, and some, like ALU, may manage to grow enough to form their own new unions, and others will die out. But they have done the labor movement a great service, no matter what their eventual fate is. They've become big, flashing billboards for the need to invest in institutional organizing capacity so that no working person is ever unable to find a union that would like to help them organize. If we don't say that out loud, the lesson will be ignored. Strong unions knock on every door. They talk to every worker. They bring the message to people who don't even know they need it. They don't sit inside while the times are tough and come out when it's sunny to find out that the big game started without them. So another thing that these independent unions can do is form a new federation. This is literally how the IWW got started in the first place. The IWW, which I hold as one of the best revolutionary organizations the United States ever had. As Hunter S. Thompson said, the last human idea in U.S. politics was the IWW. That's how they started. Some of the unions that formed up with it at their founding convention were small, like a couple dozen members. Some had thousands and thousands of members. But they came together and suddenly they formed an industrial union that had workers in every industry that there was. So that's the other option is, form a new federation. So here's hoping. Let's continue. So we talked yesterday briefly about the strike going on in the University of California system, and I have two articles that I want to read about that, and I think I gotta actually take a second and grab one of them. After we're done with these two, we will go back and chat and then wrap up for the day. But where did I put that one? I know where I put that one. There we go. Left it in yesterday's folder. Gotta put it in today's folder. Come on now. The people are waiting. There we go. Alrighty. So, Nelson Lichtenstein is industrial relations, labor studies teacher. As I mentioned in yesterday's stream, he wrote a book called State of the Union, which if you're looking for a good, just sort of overall history of U.S. labor in the 20th century, that is a very good place to start. Check it out. But anyway, he was writing an article. He's in the University of California system and wrote an article about it, and then also recommended another article, which we'll be reading right after this. So here's the article. This is in The Guardian, Monday, December 5th. The California academic strike is the most important in U.S. higher education history. The University of California is trying to divide and conquer the 48,000 workers on strike by acceding to the demands of some groups, but not others. A picture there of the strike, UAW on strike, unfair labor practice, the signs all say. The strike is not just an effort to raise thousands of academic workers out of near poverty, but a movement whose success will require a reversal of the austerity that has subverted the higher education promise in California and elsewhere. Let me just add here for a moment. I have many criticisms of Chris Hedges. There's also a few things that he's done and said I really like. One of them, his overall narrative about the destruction of, civil society and working class institutions since, during the post-war era and especially since neoliberalism. I think that's actually a true, accurate, and important story that needs to be told about what's happened. This general feeling we have now of there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, places where people, can come together as working people and do their thing. Everybody's just doing everything sort of online as we've been driven out of real space by capital. The public university system is definitely part of this, where you could get affordable education, not just so you can make more money at your job, but so you can understand more about the world and get more out of life, and then take that back to your people, back to your class, and or other oppressed groups within the working class. Whether you're working on gender inequality or racial and ethnic inequality, heterosexism, etc. You can learn a lot in universities about that and actually partake in organized, structured study about it that can actually get you somewhere. So it's important. And when they talk about the austerity that has subverted the higher education promise in California and elsewhere, I think that's the same thing of that, the corrosion of spaces that used to be able to benefit working class people. All right. The strike by unions representing 48,000 academic workers at the University of California stands at a perilous crossroads. It is by far the largest and most important strike in the history of American higher education, with the potential to transform both the status and income of those who work in an industry that now employs more workers than the federal government. Despite all the disruption, the strike has generated virtually no opposition from either the faculty or from most undergraduates. Indeed, student leaders at all 9 University of California campuses have endorsed the demand by their graduate student teaching assistants and other academic workers for a substantial wage increase designed to offset the soaring cost of California housing, as well as the larger inflationary riptide that has eroded even the paltry salaries, grants, and fellowships upon which so many of them rely. Most faculty are sympathetic as well, with many joining the picket lines put up each day by the United Automobile Workers, the union representing the separate locals composed of teaching assistants, tutors, and readers, postdoctoral scholars, and academic researchers. Many of the UC strikers hold that the A in UAW really stands for academic, certainly in California, where most UAW members are now employed in a university setting. After 3 weeks, however, the strike has reached a moment of danger. UC administrators have offered the postdocs and the academic researchers, about 12,000 in number, so a quarter of them, a set of 5-year contracts that modestly increase wages in year 1 and also provide a set of additional enhancements, including more money for parental leave, child care benefit, and longer appointments. But the graduate student teaching assistants, who compose a large majority of those on strike and who constitute the most militant and activist element among the unionists, have thus far been unable to persuade UC administrators to increase an initial wage offer, 7% now, followed by smaller annual increases later on, that barely compensated them for the inflationary erosion of their real incomes. So, you better believe that this was born in a union-busting strategist's, meeting room, conference room somewhere, basically trying to carve off support with various little bones being thrown that can break the solidarity here. And so, is it working? It's a divide and conquer strategy. Because the federal government pays the salaries of most postdocs and academic researchers through grants from the National Science Foundation and other funding entities, UC can more easily accede to a wage enhancement. In the case of the postdoctoral students, for more than 20% in the first year, although only 3.5% in subsequent years. But since the teaching assistants, whose current pay is the lowest of all those on strike, are funded directly out of the university budget, school negotiators have taken a hard line. Adding insult to injury, UC insists upon long contracts for all those now on strike, with relatively paltry wage increments in the out years. Most of the teaching assistants, who have made COLA, a guaranteed cost of living adjustment each year, a key demand, I think that should be in all caps, but see such a long duration contract as a recipe for more inflationary wage erosion. For the moment, all UAW members at UC remain on strike, but some union leaders seem inclined to encourage ratification of contracts covering the postdoctoral scholars and academic researchers, leaving the graduate TAs to fend for themselves. This would be a disaster, generating recrimination, division, and disaffection within the ranks of the more active grad student strikers. Again, what is up with these fucking union leaders? Like, are you not aware that this would just destroy morale and like splinter off groups from the solidarity that they had managed to find? There is still time to avoid such a debacle and instead carry the strike to victory. UC administrators plead that budget constraints foreclose the possibility of any large wage boost for the school's 36,000 graduate student workers. So again, like I said, no doubt, this is a standard divide and conquer, and it's undergirded by this financial fact, although that really in practice is more of an excuse than anything else for them to break up the strike, which is really what they want to do. Yet, California remains an immensely wealthy state with a budget surplus that almost reached $100 billion this year. Over the last several decades, however, state funding for UC, as well as even the even larger state university system, has steadily declined. So state funding for UC and the larger state university system has steadily declined over decades. This is again that destruction of the public infrastructure we're talking about. Today, just over 10% of UC's $44 billion budget is funded by California itself, down from more than half in 1963, when UC President Clark Kerr famously declared that the institution he led was a multiversity, the world-class model for the creation of a knowledge-based society. And again, this is the shit they had to do when competing against the USSR. The UC strike is therefore not just an effort to raise thousands of academic workers out of near poverty, but a movement whose success will require a reversal of the austerity that has subverted the higher education promise in California and elsewhere. That is a cause that deserves our hearty endorsement. Indeed. So let us now go to the second article on this. This is from Remaking the University, a blog by Michael Meranze and Christopher Newfield. This is from just 2 days ago, Tuesday, December 6th, The Strike. And this is, Lichtenstein had tweeted this as like the most important article on this. So let's get into it. The strike continues with no end in sight. Although there have been tentative agreements concerning postdocs and academic researchers, in the academic student employee and student researcher units, the parties appear to remain well apart on the fundamental economic issues. This distance is most easily seen in the ASE category. Although the UAW made significant adjustments in its proposed UC, could use a comment there, there. Although the UAW made significant adjustments in its proposal, UC responded with little change. You can see the latest UAW wage proposal here and the latest UC wage proposal here. It is impossible from the outside to tell where the negotiations are headed, but what I want to try to do here is offer some suggestions for how we could think about the gap, how we got here, and what we might do in the future to alter the conditions that have created what is undoubtedly a crisis at the university and a depressing foreshadowing of the end of UC as a serious research university. If the latter does happen, the responsibility will ultimately lie with UCOP and the regents, with some support from the campus chancellors. The first point is that it seems clear that there's a fundamental gap in the way that each side is defining these negotiations. UC is approaching this as if it were a conventional labor negotiation with a class of workers whose position is fundamentally stable. The UAW and its supporters, on the other hand, start from the position that they've been placed in an untenable economic position. Given the fact that TA wages have barely kept up with national inflation over the years, combined with the extreme cost of housing in California, talking about that earlier, they cannot continue with relatively minor adjustments in the dollar amount of their monthly pay. In other words, it needs an overhaul because of conditions. To make matters worse, UC's latest offer has a first-year adjustment that is about equal to current inflation. In this light, UCOP appears completely out of touch with the reality of life on campuses and indifferent to its lack of knowledge. So it's out of touch, and it does not care that it's out of touch. This image of autocratic disregard was only deepened by Provost Brown's appalling letter to the faculty last week. Although much of it was standard UCOP pablum, he inspired widespread faculty hostility with his closing flourish threatening faculty members who refused to pick up the work of striking workers with discipline beyond the docking of pay. For the last 3 years, faculty and lecturers have performed an enormous amount of additional labor to keep the university afloat during the pandemic, transforming their courses, spending additional time with students, planning for campus transformations, and putting their research duties on the side to maintain instructional continuity, as the administration likes to put it. So in other words, they're having to step away from their research to do the teaching. After all this effort, for the provost to threaten disciplinary action for those who choose not to pick up the work of striking TAs, or to act upon their own convictions about academic integrity, manifests a contempt for the faculty that is hard to ignore. Whoops, wrong thing. This is what I said before about naming things too close together. There we go. It's important to grasp UC's budgetary situation correctly. Most importantly, the usual invocation of the university's $46 billion budget needs to be put aside. Most of that budget is tied up in medical centers or in funding for designated purposes. The real budget that's relevant is the core budget, made up of tuition, state funding, and some UC funds. It comes in closer to $10 billion and is largely tied up in salaries across the campuses. As Chris and I have been pointing out for nearly 15 years, UC has been subject to core educational austerity surrounded by compartmentalized, privatized wealth, although we should notice that the medical centers barely stay in the black. This crisis will not be overcome by hidden caches of money floating around the university. The problem is deeper than that. So in other words, there's all these people striking whose pay is not even remotely commensurate with the general conditions of life right now. So where are they going to come up with the money to pay these people? And so what this guy is saying is it's not just a matter of like finding some, change stuffed in the couch somewhere. They need to overhaul this whole system. So he's about to lay that out. Its roots of the money issue lie in the combination of state underfunding and the expansion of expensive, non-instructional, often non-academic research activities that have taken up too much of the campus's payrolls. But I want to stress that this reality does not mean that the graduate students are being unreasonable in seeking wages that enable them to perform their employment duties and pursue their studies. Instead, it is a sign of how deep the failure of the university has been in not providing a sustainable funding model both for students and faculty supporting students. The Academic Senate has been pointing to this problem for at least 2 decades. In statements and reports from 2006, 2012, and 2020, the Academic Senate has repeatedly insisted that graduate student support was insufficient and proposed steps to improve it. Even the administration itself has sometimes recognized its depth. To take only one example from 2019, UCOP's Academic Planning Council declared that, and this is a quote, UC must do better at financially supporting its doctoral students, particularly as it seeks to diversify the graduate student body. The university cannot compete with its peers for talented candidates if it does not offer competitive support, or even adequate support. Where were we? In 2017, the gap in average net stipend between UC and its peers was nominally $680.30. In actuality, the gap is much greater due to California's high cost of living. Very expensive living in California. With that factored in, the average gap in doctoral support is closer to $3,400. This is a huge difference, but not insurmountable. The work group urges UC leadership to make every effort to close that gap so that the quality of UC's doctoral programs is maintained and enhanced. UC campuses, with planning and prioritization, could guarantee 5-year multi-year funding to doctoral students upon admission. According to current data, about 77% of doctoral students across UC receive stable or increasing net stipends for 5 consecutive years. With some exceptions, this multi-year funding is relatively consistent across campuses and disciplines. However, this funding is typically not presented as a full 5-year, multi-year guaranteed package upon admission. Offering 5-year funding upon admission would enhance recruitment of high-potential students, offer financial security, and address one of the chief stressors for doctoral students, worry over continued funding while in the program. So timeout. So the doctoral program will be 5 years, usually 2 for the master's and 3 for the PhD, or whatever specific type of doctoral thing it is. And so, you make a commitment to that program, you need to know you've got the money there for the 5 years. Otherwise, you can get halfway through the program, put in all that work, put your life on hold, turn down other offers, and then what? Just go belly up in the middle. Continuing and finishing the quote, in addition to offering guaranteed 5-year funding, the university must address the issue of graduate student housing. Graduate students, many of whom have family responsibilities, face enormous challenges in finding affordable housing. Without a targeted effort to address graduate student housing, UC's capacity to attract and retain qualified candidates is at serious risk. Unquote. And yet the problem persists. The Academic Senate has stressed this issue repeatedly and with great force. A recent letter from the UCLA Divisional Senate's Executive Board has pointed its finger at the problem, the need for renewed state funding. It is time for the administration to do something to fix it, and something that doesn't simply damage other parts of the academic endeavor. UCOP will continue, as they always do, to insist that we can't get more money out of the state to pay for what needs to be done. But let's press on that point a little more. It's certainly possible that we're heading for a recession. The Federal Reserve seems determined to induce one in order to put labor in its place. Remember, labor is weaker during recessions because there's less demand for labor. But does that mean that the state doesn't have the capacity to respond to an emergency at the university? Despite all the talk about a budget shortfall, Dan Mitchell at the UCLA Faculty Association blog has been pointing out that the situation is far less clear than the legislative analyst is insisting, and the university is repeating. For one thing, revenues have been higher than expected, and that even with the possibility of a downturn, the state has around $90 billion in usable reserves. If the state won't help, it's not because of economic necessity, but a matter of political choice. Like so many things today. After all, the governor had no problem finding $500 million to pay for a private immunology research park at UCLA that provides little, if any, real benefit to the campus academic program. The governor and the state can do more for the educational core of the university than they're doing. And if UCOP and the regents can't show the state how necessary that is, then one wonders again what their purpose is. Final page. I want to make one final point. UC is the research university of the state, and UC insists that graduate education is at the heart of its purpose. But if UCOP actually agrees with that, then the question must be, what do we need to do to have academic graduate education in a sustainable form? What resources do we need to enable students to both contribute to the larger functioning of the university and to pursue their studies? Are we willing to have only graduate programs where students have family money or have already flipped a startup, or where they're here to gain an additional credential to take back to their jobs? Does UCOP remain committed to UC's contributions to disciplines across the spectrum of knowledge, or does it only care about graduate students and others as cheap and disposable labor? I don't expect that these negotiations or this strike can answer or settle these questions, but UC is at a crossroads, and the university, especially its leadership, must face up to that. The long-term question raised by the strike is whether UC will continue as a research university. If we don't make it possible for future scholars to attend, we will have forfeited our purpose. There is an opportunity here to take the first steps toward creating a new sustainable vision of a 21st century research university. Or we can continue as we have in decline. The choice ultimately is UCOP's and the regents. There's sort of a postscript. I focused here on the ASE unit because the student researcher unit is admittedly a more complicated problem. The vast majority of GSRs are supported by external grants, and those grants have both limits and their own rules. To some extent, UC has been negotiating with someone else's money. That doesn't mean the situation is impossible, but rather that it has to be implemented in such a fashion as to protect principal investigators from damaging unintended consequences. It's posted by Michael Meranze. So anyway, a look inside the strike there, and this is key because, who has a right to higher education? Is, higher education just going to be reduced to vocational stuff and sort of a vocational track? And even where there is, master's programs and doctoral programs, are they just going to be in a professional track that is not research-oriented but just intended to be applied directly in a workplace? Again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but is that all it's ever going to be? And if you want to do research, you have to be from a rich family or take out $1 million in debt, et cetera, et cetera. These should not be questions that we should be debating in the richest country in the history of the world. The resources are there. Again, it's a political question of, do working people get a right to higher education in a way that is really a liberating thing? Is this going to become more and more commonplace for people to get that high level of education, or is it going to be shrinking? And then even where people do get a bachelor's, a master's, even sometimes a doctorate, is going to be specifically geared to just plugging them into the state economy in a way, which has some real benefits. I mean, you don't want to get a degree and then float around unemployed forever, certainly. But limiting it just to professional track programs also has drawbacks. I mean, there's sort of ways around it, ways to make even those programs more liberating if that becomes a trend. I'm sure people will find creative ways to resist that and to push back on that. But I mean, this is structurally, they've cut the funding to the point where people just cannot step into these roles and get enough money to survive without some form of panhandling, doing some side hustle online or something like that. This is just not a situation we should be having in, again, the richest country in the history of the earth. So yet we are here. And, are these the last days of this system? Does neoliberalism end in fascism and a cloud of dust? Does the end of the system come with workers taking it over and tearing down what needs to be torn down and rebuilding new governance structures over it? I certainly hope the latter. That's what this channel is about. Now, we're going to finish out today with some chat, and before we get to that, let us first of all thank the patrons. The names are on the screen. Patreon, speaking of side hustles, patreon.com/socialismforall. No, seriously, I would make content even if nobody supported. I would not be able to spend nearly as much time on it. I do enjoy doing this. There's things I like more or less about it, but I think we're starting to find our stride with the live streams a bit more. And, it's just been continuing to grow. So if you like this channel, thank a patron. Consider becoming one yourself. Several people I've already signed up this month in December, and I've gotten all your names on there. Some months I struggle with this. I happen to have a bit of extra free time. So, we're able to do the audiobooks and this and that. But, anyway, it's hugely appreciated. Also, whether you're a patron or not, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Even if it's thanks, good video, something like that. That helps YouTube to recommend this content to more and more people. Again, hoping by the end of the decade that the U.S. and whatever other English-speaking, people are, finding this content, are able to improve their left, in the U.S. and beyond. It's what we would really like to see. A better, less chauvinist, more internationalist, more effectively anti-imperialist, more effectively anti-fascist, more effectively anti-revisionist left. I think we can do it. I already see signs of progress. And, we've only been doing this for less than 3 years. Obviously, there's other channels too. But, we want to make all the contribution that we can. So let's finish out today's chat. There's another, I think we're going to do pictures of amazing birds and plants a lot. So I'll keep that up on the screen while we finish out today's chat. All right, found the gnocchi comment, so we're in the right place. Did I take a look at the Marxist Unity group and their points of unity and immediate task? I was I spent like 2 hours today closing up. I have like I don't know how many hundreds of tabs open. I came across the tab again. It is getting closer to getting my full attention. I have not had a chance to look at it yet, but it is in. I organized it to where it's getting closer to my attention. There you go. Let's see. I have no job and I can't go to college because COVID and it's scammy as fuck. I'm sorry to hear that because, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you would rather not, like, do nothing, you know? I've had periods where I was, you know, in a similar situation and it sucks. It sucks. It's lonely. It's like, you know, you don't have much personal news to talk about. I get what you're saying. Unions also need to be attempting to unionize other areas of their industries. My union downright refuses, and I've been fighting them on that. Yeah. Remember that the UC system is the largest university system in the country. Yeah, absolutely. So what happens there is going to have consequences for everybody across the country. Like literally the choice people have that I know is to teach a 5 out of 5 course load. What's a 5.5 course load? Or maybe get a 5.4 course load without any real benefits or security, just lots of stress and endless work. Even the PhD stipends are literally below poverty level. I know somebody who only makes $15,000 a year. Oh, okay, 5 classes each semester. What's 5.4? Waiting for typing. We're actually caught up. This is oh, 5 in the fall, 4 in the spring. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's the whole issue here about also like adjunct professors where you just sort of get paid a fee and it's like a flat, you know, couple $1,000 whether you're teaching like 10 students or like 100, and it's ridiculous. And also just hiring people with no real training and education, you know, who are just like retirees from some industry. They don't know how to couldn't teach their way out of a paper bag, but they have like some kind of relevant experience and they pick up an adjunct job because they don't really need the money. Just fucking, oh my God. Yeah. In terms of other groups, which I think may have a good platform, somebody linked to counterpower.info. It's a new one on me. I will take a look. And yeah, Petunia, I'll take a look at those links that you were saying before. Probably by next week's streams, I'll have a chance to look at that Marxist Unity group and the points of unity. I think this was things within DSA, pretty weak stuff. There was like the Marxist Unity group within DSA. I was looking for, I may have mentioned this in a previous stream, but you know, I was just going around looking for different recommended reading lists from Marxist groups, and I swear to God, like, the Marxist, if it's the one I'm thinking of, they had all these like Kautsky recommendations, and it was just mind-blowing. Like, I know that there's criticisms of, you know, I mean, these were, I don't know what to say. I'm just like flabbergasted. It was like the Kautsky heavy reading list, and not just the early stuff. Amazing. Like there haven't been any significant developments since Kautsky went renegade. Interesting. All right. We are going to, so this counterpower.info, we are a communist political organization based in the U.S. empire. So yeah, there's a fair amount of these. I mean, there's Leading Light. There's a bunch. You know, how many of these actually become larger organizations? Time will tell. But yeah, I'll take a look at that website. All right, I'm going to sign off for today. We have reached the end of the chat. We have gotten enough bird to detox a little bit. And thanks to everybody who showed up. This was a good stream again. I appreciate all the comments, and you know, you help make this what it is live. Thanks also to people listening to YouTube after the fact and leaving your comments there. We'll be back again next week, and there will be more audiobooks in the meantime. See you in the next video.